It was a bright summer day in the year 1906, and Dr. William C. Clark and his wife Harriet were driving slowly through a beautiful part of northwestern Connecticut called Litchfield County. Litchfield County is a rural and very hilly area with lots of winding country roads, and the Clarks were there to try to scout out an area to build their second home. The couple lived full-time in New York City, where Dr. Clark worked as a highly respected oncologist, which is a cancer doctor, and he was also a professor at the Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons. And while the Clarks' lives were very exciting and fulfilling in the city, they were also very hectic and chaotic. And so the reason they had settled on Litchfield County as the place to look for a location for their second home is because it was the total opposite of the city. It was quiet, it was peaceful, it was absolutely perfect. And so as this couple from New York City drove along these winding backcountry roads, they eventually reached this beautiful covered wooded bridge. And after they drove across it, they got this incredible view up onto this mountainside off to their right. And high up on this mountain was this huge, shaded, beautiful forest. And they saw there was a road that appeared to kind of spider off and go right into these woods. Now, the couple had no idea what was up there, but it was just so beautiful, and they were immediately so drawn to it that they decided they would go check it out and see if maybe there was a spot for their second home in these woods. And so Dr. Clark took the car and he went up this access road. And very quickly, as they began climbing up this hillside, the road became very bumpy and overgrown. It was pretty obvious that not many cars were driving into these woods. And so before they even reached the tree line, Dr. Clark had to pull the car over and park it on the side of the road. And then he and Harriet got out, and then on foot, they continued up towards the forest. And once the couple actually entered the forest, immediately the sunlight faded because the canopy over their heads was so thick, and the air became cool and refreshing. And after walking for only a couple of minutes, the forest, which at first seemed very still and quiet, suddenly became alive. They could hear birds chirping and animals running around and insects buzzing, and then up ahead they saw there was this field off to the side of the road that was full of all these wild apple trees growing in all different directions. And as they got closer, they saw there was a deer right in the middle of the apple trees eating apples directly off the branches. And then just past all these apple trees, the couple began passing these huge, beautiful patches of roses and lilacs and bright yellow, bitter tansy flowers that lined the road. And then before long, the couple was stepping over these babbling brooks. And off in the distance, they could hear the sound of running water, like fresh spring water coming down off the mountain. And then as the sun did begin to poke through the canopy above them, it almost looked like the forest was sparkling. Literally, this forest was sitting on a hillside, and the hillside, which was made up of rock, had mica inside of it. And mica is a kind of mineral that when sunlight hits it, it almost looks like it is shimmering. And of course, there were the owls. As Dr. Clark and his wife walked farther and farther into this beautiful forest, they heard more and more owls hooting off in the distance. And to the Clarks, this made the forest feel enchanted. It was like the owls were personally greeting them. By the time the couple had turned around and begun heading back to their car, they had already made up their mind that they were going to build their second home in that forest. And so after returning to their home in New York, they promptly put in the paperwork to purchase 1,000 acres inside of that Connecticut forest. And that forest had a name. It was called Dark Entry. And it was named that because it looked like from the outside the forest was basically dark all the time. There was shade cast on it from mountains nearby, and then also the canopy inside of Dark Entry is exceptionally thick. At one time, there actually had been a town inside of Dark Entry Forest. However, all the people who had lived in that town were now all gone. The only remnants of this town were a couple of crumbling stone walls and a couple of home foundations that were scattered about the Dark Entry Forest floor. The Clarks had seen some of these ruins as they walked along this overgrown path through the forest, but they were not concerned. Instead, they felt like these ruins actually added some charm to the forest. After the land purchase was finalized, Dr. Clark began looking for local builders in Connecticut who could help him build this second home inside of Dark Entry Forest. But no matter how much money he offered these local Connecticut builders, they all said no. Now, none of them gave a straight answer to Dr. Clark about why they were turning him down. So Dr. Clark just kind of assumed that, hey, this project is not huge. It is just one house and the forest is pretty isolated and hard to get to. And so he thought, probably these builders think it is not worth the effort. But Dr. Clark was not discouraged. He decided he would just build the house himself. After all, he was a very handy, competent guy who had grown up on a farm in New Jersey, and so he knew how to build things. And so for the next several months, Dr. Clark would travel from New York City to Dark Entry Forest every weekend, and he would build this home. First, he cut down this massive swath of hemlock trees on this one flat patch of his land. And then with all this lumber he had cut down, he built his rustic two-story cabin on this flat part of his land. And then nearby on this hilltop, there was a freshwater spring at the top. And so he laid piping from the spring into his cabin so they could have fresh water. And then at the bottom of this nearby hill was this brook. and Dr. Clark loved just standing and watching this brook because inside of it were all these trout that would dart all around. And so Dr. Clark built a swimming pool with beautiful mossy embankments right up against this brook so he could sit there and watch the fish. By Thanksgiving of that year, the cabin was done, and so Dr. Clark and his wife Harriet, they stayed at the cabin to celebrate the holiday. And as they were sitting in their swimming pool watching the trout and listening to the owls hoot off in the distance, they both agreed that this second home was like their little piece of heaven. So every summer from there on out, and every major holiday that they could manage it, the Clarks would travel to their home in Dark Entry Forest, and they would swim and hike and relax, and they would watch the leaves on the mountainside turn from green to bright yellows and oranges and reds. It was absolutely perfect. That is, until the year 1918. That summer, the couple was in their second home in the forest when Dr. Clark was suddenly called back to New York to attend to a medical emergency. Harriet was very upset at the prospect of suddenly being left alone in this cabin in the middle of the forest by herself for who knows how many days. And so when she dropped her husband off at the nearby train platform, she made him promise that he would come back soon. And he said he would. And then Dr. Clark got on the train. It took off, and Harriet just stood there with her arms crossed, watching it as it chugged along off into the distance. From his comfortable seat on that train, Dr. Clark had no idea that his wife was about to endure a nightmare while he was gone. When the Clarks bought their 1,000 acres in the Dark Entry Forest, they did virtually no research on the forest or the surrounding area. If they had, they very likely would not have purchased that land. You see, the town that used to be inside of the Dark Entry Forest, that was now just ruins that the Clarks saw when they first walked around inside of the forest, was abandoned for a very specific reason. It was cursed. At least, that is what the locals say. And in fact, that was the reason why no builders in the area were willing to go with Dr. Clark into the forest to go build his house, because they were too scared to go anywhere near the ruins of this cursed town. This town, which was known as Dudleytown, was first settled sometime in the 1740s. At first, it was just a couple of people and a couple of small structures. But pretty quickly, 30 families had moved in, and it was a thriving little town. But as the 1700s came to a close, terrible things began to happen to residents of this town. First, there was the Carter family. They moved to Dudleytown in 1759, and shortly after arriving there, 6 members of their family all died suddenly from cholera. The remaining branch of the Carter family was so grief-stricken from their losses that they left Dudleytown and went to New York, where they resettled. But almost immediately after getting set up there, Native Americans raided their property and massacred them. And the 3 people that survived this massacre were 3 of the kids, and they were all kidnapped and taken away. In 1792, a Dudleytown resident named Hollister died suddenly. Now, we do not know if he fell off a roof or if he was murdered. No one really knows, but what we can agree on is that his untimely death happened in the home of a man named Tanner. And Tanner, following Hollister's death, suddenly just began obsessively talking about these strange creatures he was seeing out in the woods at night, kind of roaming around the Dark Entry Forest, and he talked about it all the time, and nobody listened to him. And eventually, Tanner went insane, and his daughter had to care for him for the rest of his life. And while Tanner was slowly losing his mind, his next-door neighbor named Abel also began reporting that he was seeing weird creatures roaming around the tree line all around the town. And as Abel continued to report seeing these strange creatures lurking in the shadows, he too slowly went mad and had to be cared for until his death. In the early 1800s, a famous Revolutionary War hero, General Herman Swift, who lived in Dudleytown, lost his mind shortly after his wife was struck by lightning and killed. And then in 1813, an unknown epidemic rolled through Dudleytown and killed many of its residents. After that, more and more residents of Dudleytown either died suddenly or died mysteriously, and also more and more residents began coming forward with stories about having seen these strange, shadowy creatures moving around the tree line at night. By about 1900, all the Dudleytown residents had either died or simply just left, abandoning their homes, except for one family, the Brophies. But in quick succession, the Brophy family sheep all died. Then the mother died of tuberculosis. Then the 2 sons were accused of theft in a nearby town, and then they just disappeared, leaving one person, John Brophy, the father. But then, the Brophy family home burned to the ground, and so John, who was overcome with grief, just wandered off into the forest and was never heard from again. At that point, Dudleytown officially became a ghost town. No one lived there. And it was at that point in 1906 when Dr. Clark and Harriet had their beautiful summer day walk through the forest and discovered where they wanted to build their second home. So, fast forward back to 1918, and Dr. Clark, he is on his medical emergency leave to New York. It winds up being very quick. He is back on a train within 36 hours, and he pulls into the station right near Dark Entry Forest, and he is expecting to see Harriet waiting on the platform for him. But when the train rolled into the station, she was not there. Now, Dr. Clark was not a superstitious person, but for some reason, when he did not see his wife there, he just felt like something was off. There was no reason she would not have come out here to greet him. I mean, she was worried about being all alone in the cabin, and she knew he was going to be arriving at that moment. And so, feeling a little bit panicked, Dr. Clark left the train station and on foot made his way over to the dark entry forest. And when he got there and began walking on that overgrown road path that led to his house, immediately as soon as he was within the shade of the trees, he began hearing these owls hooting very loudly off in the distance. Now, normally the sound of these owls hooting made him feel welcome, but this time he felt scared. He felt like something was wrong up ahead. And so he began jogging through the forest, and it is very dark, and all he can hear is the sound of these owls, and it is getting louder and louder and louder. And then finally, he reaches the clearing where his property is, and at this point, it is a cacophony of owls hooting practically right on top of him. And he looks up towards his house up on this hill, and he sees the front door is slightly open. And so now, with his heart racing, wondering what is going on with his wife, Dr. Clark runs up to his front porch, he gets to the door, and he flings it open the rest of the way. And then right before he stepped into his house, this sudden, high-pitched noise began up on the second floor inside of his house. And it was so startling to Dr. Clark that he just froze where he was. And so suddenly, it is so loud from the owls all around him in the woods behind him, and whatever this noise is, that he just stood there unsure what to do. And so as he is sitting there getting the courage up to go investigate his house, he realizes what this high-pitched noise is. It is the sound of maniacal, insane laughter coming from the second floor. Sensing his wife had to be in danger, the doctor charged up the nearby steps up to the second floor, and he could tell this laughter, this high-pitched laughter, was coming from the master bedroom. And so he ran down the short hallway. He got in front of the closed door that led into the master bedroom. He slowly opened it up, and there, in the back corner of his room, was his wife. She was on the ground, rolled up in a ball facing the door. Her hands were clenched in fists. Her eyes were wide open and unblinking, and her mouth was open wider than was humanly possible. And as he is staring at his wife, wondering what is going on, he realizes this insane, high-pitched laughter is coming from his wife. But it does not even look like it is coming out of her. Her chest is just heaving, her mouth is staying open, and the laughter is just coming out of her. And so the doctor just stood there watching his wife, who was staring directly at his eyes. And finally, he just got so scared, he turned and he ran. During Dr. Clark's 36 hours he was away in New York, something happened to his wife. We do not know what it was, but it caused her to lose her mind completely. The only thing she would talk about was the strange creatures she saw out in the forest. By some accounts, Harriet spent the rest of her life in a mental asylum. By other accounts, she went back with Dr. Clark to New York, where she eventually took her own life. Today, Dudleytown is not only still abandoned, but it is also illegal to visit. However, people do still sneak into Dudleytown and walk around the ruins, and many of them have reported feeling these pockets of cold air where there should not be cold air. And also, some others have said, as they have been walking, they have felt phantom hands slap them and push them. Some have said they have taken photographs inside of the dark entry forest near Dudleytown, and they have captured strange, shadowy figures that they could not see with their naked eye. The famous paranormal couple Ed and Lorraine Warren shot a special series in the 1970s inside of the dark entry forest, and they declared the area around Dudleytown was demonically possessed. Now, let us transition to a very different kind of mystery, one that took place in a bustling suburb of Southern California but is no less terrifying or strange. On the night of February 19, 1994, a man in Southern California called 911 because his girlfriend was struggling to breathe. When the 911 dispatcher picked up this man's call, he was very distraught and asked them to please send an ambulance as fast as you possibly can. But despite how upset this man was on the phone, he was not actually surprised the situation was unfolding. His girlfriend, 31-year-old Gloria Ramirez, had been diagnosed with terminal cervical cancer just 6 weeks earlier, and the doctors had told her that she likely did not have much time left. And making this even more tragic, Gloria had actually gone into the hospital a few years earlier with symptoms and signs that she likely had cancer, but the doctors missed it. Had they caught it back then, they likely could have saved her life. Still, after receiving her very grim diagnosis just a few weeks earlier, Gloria had resolved to fight her cancer as best as she could. After all, she had a lot to lose. Gloria had 2 young kids. She had a boy and a girl who were 9 and 12 years old, respectively. And Gloria absolutely adored them and really devoted her life to them. In the evenings, she would play with them and help them with their homework. And the whole time, she would be cracking jokes to make them laugh and smile. And then even when Gloria was not actively parenting her kids, she was always a very positive presence in their lives. She was optimistic, she was happy, she was upbeat, and oftentimes she could be found wandering around with a big smile on her face, singing a religious hymn to herself. So, when Gloria got this terrible news that she had late-stage cancer, she was obviously terrified and sad, but she was also very determined to find a way to survive because she knew her kids still needed her. Around the time Gloria was diagnosed, her doctors told her she would begin radiation treatment for her cancer at the end of February, so she had a few weeks to wait. And so during this waiting period, Gloria found herself spending a lot of time researching her disease, looking for things she could be doing on her own right now to make herself feel better or even potentially increase the odds of her survival. So on February 19th, when Gloria told her boyfriend that she was starting to have some issues breathing, the boyfriend did not hesitate for a second to call 911 because he knew firsthand from living with Gloria that she was desperate to survive. And so any changes in her symptoms needed to be treated like an absolute emergency. It was around 8 p.m. that night when the ambulance pulled up in front of Gloria's home. Paramedics climbed out, they rushed over to Gloria, they put her on a stretcher, they gave her a mask with oxygen, and then they loaded her into the back of the ambulance, and then seconds later, they were flying down the road with their sirens blaring. While they sped toward the hospital in Riverside, which is a city about an hour east of Los Angeles, one of the paramedics on board the ambulance called ahead to the Riverside Hospital emergency room to talk to one of the doctors. And the doctor who answered was a 33-year-old woman named Dr. Julie Gorczynski. And she loved her job. She loved the thrill and excitement and challenge of working in a big city emergency room, and so she takes this call. The paramedics tell her that they have a patient who has terminal cancer. She is having a hard time breathing, and her heart rate is becoming very unstable to the point where, if it is not controlled soon, it is going to kill her. And they told Julie they would be there in about 5 minutes. And so Julie, she hangs up the phone and immediately began preparing for receiving a critical patient, as well as getting Trauma Room 1 ready, which is where Gloria would be treated. Now, as bad as this situation was for Gloria, for Julie, and the other nurses and doctors in this emergency room, this was kind of business as usual. They were used to receiving patients that were in very rough shape. And so as Julie and the rest of her medical team waited for this ambulance to arrive, none of them were worried that they would not be able to handle this patient. They thought tonight was going to be as routine as any other night. However, they would be very, very wrong. The ambulance ride took about 15 minutes, so they pulled into the Riverside Hospital right at 8:15 p.m. And as soon as the ambulance came to a stop, the paramedics jumped out. They ran around to the back, they opened up the back doors, they pulled Gloria out, still on her stretcher, and they pushed her as fast as they could through the doors into the emergency room. Once inside, Julie and the rest of her team, they took Gloria, and they pushed her left down a hallway into Trauma Room 1. Once inside, the doctors and nurses immediately noticed that Gloria's heart rate was spiking dramatically, and her blood pressure was falling dramatically. So, Julie and her team began administering a standard set of treatments for someone in this condition. They switched Gloria's oxygen mask she had been using on the ambulance ride for a more powerful one. They gave her painkillers, sedatives, and drugs to help steady her heartbeat. And at first, the treatment seemed to be working because pretty quickly, Gloria's heartbeat began to level out. However, it did not last. Soon, Gloria's heartbeat was racing so insanely fast that all of these alarms were going off on her heartbeat monitor. Knowing they had to act quickly, Julie and her team began removing Gloria's t-shirt in order to administer electric shocks to her chest with paddles. This is a way for doctors to kind of reset a patient's heartbeat. As the nurses got the electric paddles ready, they and the rest of the medical team suddenly noticed two strange things about Gloria. The first was that Gloria seemed to be emitting this strange garlicky smell from her mouth. The second was Gloria's skin looked very greasy. However, despite the entire medical team taking note of these two things, no one thought they were significant. Lots of patients suddenly are brought into the ER, and very rarely do they have a chance to shower or brush their teeth beforehand. And so they figured that was the reason she looked and smelled that way. Finally, the big electrical paddles were ready, and so the nurses placed them on either side of Gloria's heart. And then they began sending powerful bolts of electricity into Gloria's chest. While the nurses worked on Gloria's heart, other members of the medical team needed to assess Gloria's overall condition. And so to do that, they needed to draw her blood. So a nurse took an alcohol wipe and cleaned a small spot on Gloria's arm, and then she took a syringe and jabbed it inside of Gloria and began the draw. And as soon as she did this, Trauma Room 1 filled with a new smell. It was a chemical smell. And Julie immediately noticed it. And she looked over at the nurse doing the blood draw and she said, "I think it smells like ammonia in here." And the nurse who was doing the blood draw kind of scrunched her face up in disgust and nodded in agreement. The nurse finished the blood draw and then handed the blood vial to Julie. And as Julie was taking this blood vial from the nurse, she noticed the nurse looked suddenly very confused and very disoriented. Her eyes were kind of flickering, and she was staring straight ahead like she did not know where she was. And so Julie, she sees this in the nurse, and then she glances down at this blood vial in her own hand now, and she sees something she has never seen before. The blood inside this vial, Gloria's blood, was full of these small, white, flat crystals. But before Julie could tell anybody else in the room about these strange crystals in the patient's blood, the nurse who had done the blood draw went from being dazed and confused to collapsing flat on the ground. Luckily, another doctor had seen the nurse starting to collapse and dove out and caught her right before her head hit the ground. This collapsed nurse was very quickly placed on a stretcher and wheeled out of Trauma Room 1 so the other doctors and nurses could focus on Gloria, who was obviously dying. So Julie, who was still just standing in the middle of this room holding this vial of blood, was wondering what the heck just happened to her colleague. And she is also looking down at these crystals, thinking, I have never seen this before. What does this mean? And right as she was about to flag one of the other medical team members over to look at it, Julie began feeling very nauseous and her head started spinning. And then she felt like she might collapse. And so, not wanting to cause any more distractions for the main team, she quickly placed this vial of blood on a nearby tray. And then she quickly made her way out of Trauma Room 1 and sat down in a nearby chair. And as soon as she sat down, another staff member at the hospital who had not been inside of the trauma room ran over to Julie and asked her, hey, are you okay? And Julie, she looked up at the staff member and she tried to speak, but she could not. And then her eyes rolled back into her skull and she slumped forward and fell hard to the ground. And at the same moment that Julie was collapsing outside of Trauma Room 1, inside of the trauma room, there was another thud as another nurse collapsed, and then another, and then another. And before long, screams were coming out of Trauma Room 1 as people inside who had not collapsed yet are looking around seeing their colleagues just dropping like flies for no reason. And so pretty quickly, the call came out over the hospital intercom to evacuate the hospital immediately. The only people that would stay back would be a skeleton crew of doctors and nurses and Gloria because they felt like moving Gloria outside right now would likely kill her. We need to save her right now. Outside the hospital, the parking lot very quickly filled up with doctors and nurses and other sick people on stretchers. People were screaming and crying. Sirens were blaring, and the medical staff that was still healthy was running all over the place looking for supplies to help treat their coworkers. Meanwhile, back inside of Trauma Room 1, things for Gloria only seemed to be getting worse. The 4 doctors and nurses who had stayed back continued to administer more drugs, more shocks to her chest, more oxygen. But no matter what they did, her blood pressure continued to fall and her heartbeat became fainter and fainter and fainter. Finally, at 8:50 p.m., roughly 35 minutes after Gloria had first been wheeled into the emergency room, she died. In that 35-minute window, 23 of Riverside Hospital staff had either collapsed or become very sick and then collapsed, and many of them had to be hospitalized. But the most affected person by far was Julie. She was in such bad shape by the time she made it out to the parking lot that she was actually put on an ambulance from her hospital and driven to another hospital where she was admitted to their intensive care unit. And there, a nurse drew her blood, and in it were little white crystals just like in Gloria's blood. At 11 p.m. on the same night all this craziness happened, a hazardous materials team dressed in full hazmat suits entered the Riverside Hospital to look for a chemical leak, because that was the running theory that some sort of leak had happened in the hospital. It had made its way into Trauma Room 1, and that is what had caused everyone to collapse and get sick. But despite an extensive search, the hazmat team did not find any leaks. Stumped, authorities decided to just be extra careful around this hospital and around Gloria's body until they figured out what had happened, because the fear was there was some sort of unknown or hidden toxin either in this building or on or in Gloria's body. 6 days after the incident, inside of a special airtight room while wearing full-body protective suits, doctors performed an autopsy on Gloria, and they discovered there was absolutely nothing toxic inside of her. In fact, the autopsy only revealed that Gloria had died of natural causes. Her cancer had caused her heart and her kidneys to fail. Meanwhile, although the other medical staff members who had gotten sick inside of Trauma Room 1 had mostly recovered, Julie just could not seem to get any better. She had breathing problems and pancreatitis, which is the inflammation of the pancreas, and it is very painful. And her bones were literally just starting to die, leaving her in a wheelchair. Gloria's family blamed Riverside Hospital for Gloria's death, insisting that these toxic fumes that must have been present inside of Trauma Room 1 came from the hospital, and those fumes are responsible for what happened to the staff, and they are responsible for killing Gloria. And in fact, 3 times in the 3 years leading up to Gloria's death, Riverside Hospital had had some issues with hazardous materials making their way into the hospital. There was sewer gas that came in from a drain. There was a toxic gas that was created from a sterilizer that made 2 people in the hospital sick, and some of the hospital's water was found to have algae in it. But the hospital said they checked their hospital and there was no leak. We did not cause whatever toxic fumes were inside of Trauma Room 1, and so we are not responsible for what happened to our staff or what happened to Gloria. Riverside Hospital would be searched again and again for some sort of leak. Also, Gloria's home would be searched for toxic gases, and Gloria would be autopsied 2 additional times. But no one could find anything toxic anywhere. So eventually, California's Department of Health and Human Services came forward and said they had the answer to what had happened inside of Trauma Room 1. They said it was mass sociogenic illness. Mass sociogenic illness is when a group of people all believe they have the same illness, even though there is nothing wrong with any of them. It is caused by fear and anxiety. Basically, the state of California was saying that Julie and the other 22 staff members who had gotten sick and collapsed had just pretended. They were making it up. As for Gloria, they said she just died from her cancer. Now, of course, this explanation made a lot of people unhappy, like Gloria's family and, of course, Julie, whose medical problems were very well documented. She could not walk anymore because her bones were literally dying. And so, Gloria's family and Julie said, you know what, we think the hospital is covering something up and we are going to sue. But before they did, an obscure lab located just outside of San Francisco, California, called the Forensic Science Center, was called in to do yet another investigation into what happened inside of Riverside Hospital. And what these scientists found would make history. Here is what they discovered. After Gloria was diagnosed with cancer, she began researching not only her disease, but also alternative treatments that she could do on her own before she began her radiation treatment at the end of February. And according to the scientists of the Forensic Science Center, Gloria must have begun using a well-known controversial home remedy to help with her pain. It was called dimethyl sulfoxide, or DMSO for short. In the 1960s, DMSO was prescribed to treat pain and anxiety. But as it became more popular, it was discovered that it could cause eye damage. And so the government said, you cannot use this anymore as a medicine. But even though DMSO was no longer available as a medicine, it was still being sold in gel form inside of hardware stores as a heavy-duty degreaser. And it was this type of DMSO, the gel form, that Gloria had begun rubbing all over her skin, head to toe. This was the reason when she arrived in the emergency room, her skin looked so greasy, because she was literally covered head to toe in this gel. It was also why her breath smelled like garlic, because after DMSO is absorbed into your bloodstream, you emit a sort of garlicky smell both through your pores and out of your mouth. But the discovery that Gloria had been using DMSO did not account for why all these people in the hospital began collapsing and falling ill when they were around her. It turned out on the night that Gloria's boyfriend called 911 because Gloria was suffering from breathing problems, Gloria was also suffering from another medical issue, but it was so minor the boyfriend did not think to bring it up to the 911 dispatcher or to the paramedics when they arrived. And this secret medical condition that Gloria had was a urinary tract infection, which is an infection in any part of the urinary system. These are very common and usually very easy to treat. But what nobody realized was that because Gloria had this infection, her body was not flushing out the DMSO chemicals that had seeped inside of it from all this gel on her skin. Still, even very large amounts of DMSO chemicals inside of your body or on your skin is not enough to cause any harm to you or people around you. The danger started when the EMTs in the ambulance put that oxygen mask on Gloria's face as they transported her to the hospital. Suddenly, there was this new chemical being introduced into Gloria's body, oxygen. And the scientists from the Forensic Science Center said this new chemical oxygen began interacting with the DMSO chemicals trapped inside of Gloria's body, and together they formed a new chemical. Now, if Gloria had gotten to the hospital and responded more positively to the treatments and medicines that the doctors and nurses at the ER gave her, then Julie and the rest of the staff inside of that hospital would never have gotten sick. For that to happen, for that catastrophe to play out inside of that hospital, two very specific things had to happen in the correct order. And they did. First, there was the electric shocks. When the medical team was pumping electrical shocks into Gloria's chest, the scientists from the Forensic Science Center say those charges of electricity interacted with that new chemical that had been created inside of Gloria, and it changed this new chemical again. And this time, the change made the chemical deadly. It became what is known as dimethyl sulfate, which was used as a chemical weapon in World War I. Once Gloria received those shocks to her chest, her body basically became a canister of nerve gas. And then one of the nurses drew Gloria's blood, which was the second event that ultimately set off the catastrophe. Emergency rooms are typically kept fairly cold, roughly 66 degrees Fahrenheit. But when this new deadly chemical was created inside of Gloria, it was still inside of her body where it was warm. And for dimethyl sulfate, when it is warm, it is unstable and much less dangerous. But when that nurse drew Gloria's blood, inside of the blood was the deadly chemical. And now it was no longer in Gloria, it was in this cool 66-degree room. And so it began to stabilize and started producing those little white crystals inside of the blood vial that Julie saw. And as it stabilized, it turned into a gas, and it filled the room, and the staff began to breathe it in. The scientists from the Forensic Science Center do not think that this mass poisoning event contributed to Gloria's death, meaning Gloria did really die from her cancer. Gloria's family has denied that Gloria ever used DMSO, and they still insist that the hospital was responsible for Gloria's death. The hospital would ultimately pay $8,000 in settlement money to Gloria's family, but the hospital would never admit that they did anything wrong. Julie's lawsuit against the hospital was ultimately dismissed, and her bones never really recovered from the damage that was done to them, despite 8 surgeries to try to fix them. However, Julie would eventually go back to being a practicing doctor at another hospital, and she has said the ordeal she went through inside of Trauma Room 1 at Riverside Hospital actually made her a better doctor. Now, let us travel back even further in time to a period when the wilderness of America was still being tamed, and the mysteries of the land were often attributed to forces beyond human understanding. In 1804, a man named John Bell decided his farm in North Carolina was just too small for his growing family. So he, along with his wife Lucy and their 6 kids, packed all their belongings onto wagons and then traveled more than 600 miles west to this 1,000-acre patch along the Red River in northern Tennessee. The area they settled was known as Robertson County, and at the time, it was very rural, and basically, nobody lived there. And so the Bell family, when they arrived in Robertson County, fully expected to have to work with the few families that were there to build up the settlement. Basically, they wanted to build a town from scratch. But this was the kind of work that John Bell was born for. He was raised on a farm where he had a reputation for working extremely hard and never giving up. John was very generous and excellent at working with other people. In fact, when his family was still in North Carolina, John and his very gentle and sweet wife Lucy would open their door to anybody who needed a place to stay or a hot meal. And sometimes John would just give money to his neighbors when he felt like they were down on hard times. So after arriving in Robertson County, and after the Bell family had met their few neighbors, John Bell got right to work. First, he began clearing trees off of his land, and then with that lumber, he built a 1.5-story log house up on this hill, not far from the Red River. And in fact, the Red River was a very popular picnic spot and fishing spot for the few people that lived in Robertson County. And so, in virtue of the Bell's house being so near the river, the Bell family was always running into their neighbors and saying hi and making friends. And so it was not long after John and his family had arrived and built this house that the Bell family became one of the most popular families in the area. And for many years, the Bell family lived a very happy and prosperous life in Robertson County. Most mornings, John would wake up first, and then he would rouse the children, who would then leave the house and walk through the nearby woods to go to their school, and then they would come back before sunset. And then while the kids were at school during the day, John and his older sons would go out and work the land or help build structures around town to build the settlement up, or they would build the boats that they would use to transport the tobacco and meats they produced on their farm down south for trade. John and Lucy would have 3 more kids while in Robertson County, and before long, their oldest children began getting married and starting families of their own and building their own houses nearby. But one summer day in 1817, so 13 years after the Bell family first arrived in Robertson County, John would have a very strange experience that at the time he would completely write off. But years later, they would look back and say, that is when it started. On that summer day in 1817, John was by himself. He was out walking through his cornfield near his house when he looked out and he saw this big dog just sitting in the middle of the cornfield. Now, there were lots of dogs around Robertson County, so it was not unusual to run into a dog while you were out and about. But there was something off about this dog. It almost looked misshapen, like its bones had broken many times over and reset at awkward angles. And this dog just looked way too big to be a dog. It almost looked more like a big wolf. And this dog was staring at John in a very human way, not breaking eye contact, staring right at John. Now, John was not someone who easily spooked, but standing in this cornfield, staring at this dog who was staring right back at him, John could not help but feel totally unsettled and a little bit panicked. And so John, who had his rifle with him, raised it and fired in the direction of this dog. And when he did, the dog took off running. And so John, he watched as this dog galloped away from him and disappeared into the tree line of the forest far away. And once the dog was totally out of view, John marched forward to the spot in the cornfield where this dog had been sitting. And when he got there, he was expecting to see the corn kind of pressed down from where this big animal had been sitting, but it was not. There was no sign that any big creature had been sitting right there. And as he looked around him, he saw there were no paw prints, no tracks on the ground, either coming to this spot or going in the direction that he watched this big dog run off. John was totally confused by this, but after sitting there, kind of wondering how this could be, he just told himself, you know what, I am overthinking this. It was just some big, ugly dog and I missed the shot. This is no big deal. And so John promptly turned around and walked back to his house, forgetting all about the dog. But not long after John saw this dog in the cornfield, his family began experiencing other strange things back at their house. At night, after the Bell family had climbed into bed, they would start hearing a knocking sound on the side of their house. And as soon as they got up to go inspect it, the knocking would stop. And then they would lay back down again, and they would hear it again, except it was coming from another side of the house. It was like there was someone or something outside of their house just kind of circling around them, periodically knocking on their walls. Now, John was convinced this was not the work of some animal. This was a person, a prankster, and they were hiding out in the woods somewhere. And so he instructed his family not to mention the tapping sounds to anybody in town because he thought somebody in town was doing this to them, and he did not want them to know that they were onto them. He wanted these pranksters to come back and do it again so he could catch them in the act. But over the course of several weeks, the tapping continued, and every time John would lay in wait and try to run out and see who was there would be no one, and there would be no tracks anywhere around the house, indicating that anyone had ever been there. And as unsettling as these knocking sounds were for the family, they were nothing compared to the things that happened next. One Sunday night in May of 1818, so roughly 1 year after John had seen that big dog in the cornfield and a couple of months after the knocking on the walls had begun in the Bell's household, 4 of John's sons were asleep in their bedroom inside of their home when they woke up to the sound of what sounded like a rat gnawing on one of their bedposts. Now, these boys were sleeping in 2 bunk beds, and the 2 oldest brothers were sleeping on the lower bunk. And so, they instinctively got up, stepped onto the floor to go find this rat. But the second they stepped onto the floor, the gnawing sound completely disappeared. The 2 boys searched the room for this rat, they could not find it, and when they checked all of the bedposts, there was no sign that any of them had been gnawed on. So, the 2 older brothers finally just kind of shrugged it off and climbed back in bed. The moment they closed their eyes, the gnawing sound began again. Except now it was louder and more frantic, like whatever was under there was desperately trying to chew through the wood of their beds. But again, when the 2 older brothers leapt out of their bed to go find whatever animal was doing this, the sound would completely stop and the room would go still. The boys searched the room again. There was no sign of any rat or any animal. There were no marks on the underside of their beds. And so they had no idea what to make of this. The gnawing sounds would continue all that night, making it nearly impossible for these boys to sleep. And it would happen again the next night the same way. But on the night after that, so the 3rd night, the boys heard a new sound in their room. As they are laying in their beds, exhausted from barely sleeping the last 2 nights, they began hearing what sounded like someone gasping for air underneath their beds, like they were being choked. They were gulping and smacking their lips and clawing at the underside of the beds. The 2 oldest boys were terrified, but eventually worked up the courage and leapt from their bed to confront whatever was underneath them. But again, as soon as their feet hit the floor, the sounds completely stopped and the room went still. But this time, the boys were so frightened, they decided not to try to just go back to sleep. Instead, they woke up the rest of their family, and the Bell family searched the entire house top to bottom looking for any indication of what could have been making those sounds. But there was nothing in their house. There were no marks from some animal or rat. I mean, there was no indication that anything was other than normal. Now, to this point, the Bell family had not told anybody in town about either the knocking sounds on the walls or the rat gnawing sounds or now the gulping for air sounds. And a part of that was because John had told the family, do not tell anyone because we are going to catch whoever is doing this. But another part of it was the family knew as soon as they brought this stuff up, they could be the target of ridicule because people would not believe them. But after this night, with the gulping and gasping sounds, the Bell kids really could not sleep anymore. They were just up all night terrified. And so finally, John went to one of his neighbors who he was very close with and confided in him that something weird was happening inside of his house. Now, John was not the kind of person who made things up. He was very straightforward, very honest. He did not even tell jokes. And so, this neighbor, as he is listening to this unbelievable story, just takes John at face value and says, you know what, I will stay the night in your house, and I will see if I can hear all these strange sounds. That night, the neighbor would stay with John Bell and his family in the Bell household. And sure enough, the neighbor would hear the tapping on the walls. He would hear the rat gnawing on the wood post in the boys' room, as well as that gasping and gulping sound coming from the boys' room. And this neighbor was so terrified that he did not last the night in John's house. He left in the middle of the night to go back to his house. After this, word spread quickly around Robertson County about what was happening at the Bell household. And the way the townspeople reacted was very supportive. I mean, the Bell family had been instrumental in building up the settlement, and John and his wife Lucy were so kind and generous. And so, the townspeople decided that they were going to find a way to rally around the Bell family and try to help them. So other people in town began volunteering to spend the night inside of the Bell household with the Bell family. One, because they wanted the Bell family to feel some security, having some more people around them, and 2, these people were thinking that maybe just their presence inside of the Bell household would scare off whoever or whatever was tormenting the Bells. But no matter who stayed inside of the Bell household, the noises persisted every single night. Townspeople came up with all sorts of explanations for what was happening to the Bell family, ranging from, John's youngest daughter must be behind this because she wants attention, or other people said maybe there is a family or an individual that hates the Bell family and they are targeting them and they are behind this. There was even a theory that someone in town had learned ventriloquism, which is a kind of performance where the ventriloquist throws their voice, so it sounds like it is coming from somewhere else, not from their body. And so the idea was this ventriloquist was just a prankster, and they were screwing with the Bell family. But the townspeople searched the Bell's house with the Bell family over and over again, and they never found any sign of what could be making these noises. The people in town even went so far as to have people watch each member of the Bell family as they slept at night to make sure none of them were responsible for these sounds. And sure enough, as the Bell family was being closely monitored, the noises would start, and it was very clearly not coming from anyone in the Bell family. As the months went on and the Bell family was forced to endure whatever was going on inside of their home, the people in town started to notice something odd about John Bell. Normally, John was a very engaged person that when he spoke to you, he was locked onto you and really paying attention. But at some point, after these mysterious things began happening at his house, John would be talking to someone, and then suddenly his eyes would kind of gloss over, and his jaw would go slack, and it would look like he was staring off into the distance, and then his face would start to twitch. And at first, these twitches were fairly minor and were centered just around his eyes. But over time, these twitches became much more dramatic, to the point where his jaw would start to kind of quiver up and down, and his eyes would begin blinking out of sync. And then when the twitching finally stopped, John, without saying a word to the person he had just been talking to, would just wander back to his house. He would go up to his bedroom and he would sit on his bed for hours and hours and hours, just staring at the wall, not eating, not drinking, not saying anything. The Bell family felt like they were hostages in their own home. They had no idea what was causing these things to happen or why they were happening, and they were all filled with this constant sense of dread. As for the townspeople, most of them had come to believe that whatever was happening to the Bell family was likely caused by their neighbor, Kate Batts. Kate was known to be very eccentric and kind of unpleasant, and she was known to be fairly unlucky because her husband had become disabled and her 3 kids had all died young. Kate also had this strange habit of using really big, complex words in her conversations, but she misused the words, and so everything she said kind of sounded off. Townspeople would talk about Kate Batts' witch, and they started referring to whatever was causing the strange phenomenon at the Bell household as just Kate. However, when Kate found out about this, she was totally offended and said she had nothing to do with whatever was happening to the Bells. By September of 1820, the terrifying happenings at the Bell household had been going on for 3 years, and somehow the Bell family had just learned to live with it. However, John Bell was not doing good. It was like the longer these strange things were happening, the more and more John seemed to become a shell of his former self. His sudden dazes and twitching fits began to happen more and more frequently, and the time he would spend afterwards sitting in his bedroom staring at the wall in silence would go on longer and longer and longer. In private, John would tell his wife Lucy that he believed someone or something was torturing him to death. And then one day, as John was getting sicker and sicker, one of his daughters, Esther, left the house to go gather up some eggs in the hen house, which was across the lane from where the Bell house was. And so she left the house, she crossed over the road, she began walking up towards this hen house. And as she was walking, she heard what sounded like someone moving behind her. And so she turned around and she saw there was this woman dressed all in black with her head down, walking slowly down the road she had just walked on towards her house. She is basically walking exactly where Esther had just come from. But Esther had not seen her until just now, so she was not really sure how this woman had arrived on the road. But Esther was not worried. She looked at this woman, she did not recognize her, but just assumed she was somebody from town, and that was it. And so Esther turned away from this woman and walked the rest of the way up to the hen house. She went inside, she got the eggs in her basket. And then when she came back outside again and she was back on that road, now facing in the direction of her house, she saw this woman in black with her head down was still trudging along slowly, now much closer to the Bell household. And so Esther, she began walking down the road looking at this woman, trying to figure out who she was, and as she got closer and closer, she realized she recognized her as somebody from the village. This was a neighbor of hers, and so Esther yelled out a friendly hello. But this woman in black with her head down did not turn around. She did not react. She just kept on slowly walking down the lane towards the Bell house. And so Esther began walking a little bit faster, getting closer and closer to this woman. And she yelled out a few more times, "Hey, hello, how are you?" But each time, this woman in black just appeared not to hear Esther. And Esther, she is looking around and there is nobody else out. It is just her and this woman who is now about 15 feet away from her. And so Esther starts to feel really uncomfortable about this woman. And so Esther just stops on the road and stares at the back of this woman. And the second Esther stopped, this woman who was trudging along also suddenly stopped. And then she reached up with her hands, her back is still to Esther, and she took her bonnet off of her head. A bonnet is a type of hat, and then she dropped the bonnet on the ground. And right away, this woman's black, matted hair kind of tumbled down over her back. And then this woman, without moving, began reaching up and stroking her hair, running her fingers through her hair as if she was trying to comb it out. And so Esther is watching this, kind of wondering what is going on here. And so Esther began walking slowly closer and closer to this woman to make sure she was okay. But with each step that Esther took towards this woman began running her hands faster and faster through her hair until it almost looked impossible. She was moving so fast. And then Esther realized with horror that she was not just combing her hair. This woman was grabbing clumps of her hair and pulling them out of her head. In fact, Esther could literally hear the hair being ripped from this woman's scalp. And so before long, there was hair all over the ground around this woman. And so Esther at this point is terrified. She thinks there is something wrong with this woman. And so she runs around this woman without looking at her, charges into her house, which is right in front of this lady. She goes inside, she locks the door behind her, and then Esther calls out for one of her sisters who was home and said, "Come here, come here." And the two of them went to the front window and they look out onto the road and they see the woman. She is still there in the same spot ripping her hair out. But Esther makes eye contact with this woman. And the second that happens, the woman freezes. Her hands are still in her hair and she is looking directly up at Esther. And Esther and her sister, they are kind of taken back by the way this woman is looking at them. And then this woman slowly brings her hands down and she is staring up at Esther the whole time. And then she turns suddenly and walks around the side of the property out of view of Esther and her sister. And so Esther and her sister, they shriek. They leave the front window and they run over to the side window where this woman was heading. And they saw this woman climbing up and over their fence, getting into their side property. And behind her were now 3 children who they had not seen before, just marching right behind this woman in black. And so this woman and these 3 children, in plain sight of Esther and her sister, they walk into this grove of trees on the Bell property. And so Esther and her sister, they are just staring. They have no idea what is happening. And then one by one, the woman first, then each of the children climbed their own trees. And then once all 4 of them were up in these trees, they turned around, so they were all looking directly at Esther and her sister. And then they all begin swaying with their bodies in the trees, getting these trees to bend and wave hard left and right. And so Esther and her sister are horrified. And as they are staring, Esther's husband just happens to come through the front door. And so Esther yells for him to come over here and look out the window. Look what they are doing out there. And so Esther's husband, he runs over to the window and he looks out, but he cannot see the woman or the 3 kids. He can only see trees swaying unnaturally left and right. And so Esther and her sister, they realize he is not seeing what we are seeing, what is happening. And before long, they are screaming. The husband is trying to figure out what is going on. And finally, the trio just ran from the window, went out the back door, and ran around to the side yard to go confront this woman and these children. But when they got out to the grove of trees, the woman, the kids, they were gone. And there were no tracks anywhere on the ground to indicate that anybody had been there recently. Not long after this incident, sometime in October of 1820, John Bell and one of his sons were out for a walk on their farm. And as they walked, suddenly John stopped and threw his hands up to his face as if he was protecting himself from someone trying to hit him. And then all of a sudden, John's face just went totally slack, and his body began to contort into these horrible, grotesque angles, and his back began to arch. So far, it looked like his back would break. And so John's son, he is watching this happen. He has no idea what to do. And so he just runs over and grabs his dad and tries to pull him upright. And as he does this horrifying shriek fills the air. John's son has no idea where it is coming from, but it is so loud it stops him in his tracks. And then as fast as all of this had happened, it all stopped. John was back to normal, laying on the ground, coming to, and the shrieking was gone. It was silent on their farm. And so John's son turns to his dad, and he sees John is crying on the ground, and he says to his son, "I do not have much time left." John's son would help him up, and then the 2 of them silently just walked back to the house. And John went straight to bed. A few weeks later, on the morning of December 19th, 1820, John did not come down for breakfast, and so his family went up to his bedroom to make sure he was okay. But when they found him, he was still laying in bed. He was breathing, but no matter what they did, they could not wake him up. And so one of John's sons ran to the medicine cabinet inside of their house. But when he opened it up, all the medicine was gone. And in their place was this strange glass vial that contained a smoky, dark liquid that the son had never seen before, and no one in the family had seen before. And so the family immediately called for a doctor to come to their house, both for John and also to see what this liquid was. And so the doctor showed up. He did not really know what to do for John. It did not make sense that he just was not waking up. And then the doctor checked on this liquid, and he said, "You need to test this on some farm animals to make sure we know what it does." And so the family went out and found a stray cat, and they force-fed it some of this liquid. And within minutes, the cat had died. The Bell family swore they had not put that vial in the medicine cabinet. They had no idea what it was or how it got there. As for John, he would not wake up that day. And in fact, the following morning, when he was still in bed, he died. After John's death, the strange occurrences at the Bell household basically all came to a stop for the most part. Some people in town reported after John's death seeing strange lights floating around the Bell property, and also sometimes they reported hearing a strange, sing-song voice kind of coming from somewhere out around their property. John's wife Lucy would remain inside of that house until 1838 when she passed away. Today, there is nothing left of the Bell household. However, there is a cave on their property, an underground cave, and people swear that is where whatever tormented the Bells came from. Now, let us cross the ocean to another corner of the world where the boundaries between life, death, and what lies beyond became blurred in a way that defied science and captured the attention of researchers from around the globe. At the end of December in 1984, in a little village in northern India, a young woman named Sumitra had her first child with her husband. And right away, Sumitra fell in love with her little baby boy. She had always wanted a baby, and now that she had one, she carried him with her everywhere, strapped to her chest. And anytime she had a free hand from cooking or housework, she would use it to pat his head or tickle his feet. Life was not easy for anyone in Sumitra's village, which was located just south of the Himalayan mountains along the Ganges River. Sumitra's village was very poor. People lived in mud huts with thatched roofs. They had no electricity, and basically, no one had any formal education. As for Sumitra, her life was especially challenging, even relative to her peers, because when she was very young, her mother died, and then her father had to go away all the time for work, and so she was left alone a lot and basically was raised by a cousin. And now, even though she was married, her husband also had to travel quite a bit for work. And so Sumitra, she lived with her husband's parents in their hut. But the reality was she was not nearly as close with them as she was with her own family, and her own family was nowhere nearby. And so Sumitra's life was really quite lonely, even as an adult. And so when Sumitra had her baby, it was like for the first time in her life, she did not feel alone, and she was excited about her life. She was happy that something was finally going the way she wanted it to. But then one day in early 1985, everything changed. That day, Sumitra, with her son attached to her chest, was walking into town to get water from the well. And as she was walking along the dirt path, she suddenly came to a stop, very rigid, and she dropped her bucket on the ground. A couple of other villagers who were nearby heard the bucket fall. They turned and looked at Sumitra, who was standing there totally rigid. And so, one of these villagers who was very concerned walked over to Sumitra and asked her what was going on. But Sumitra, she did not say anything. She just stood there frozen. And this concerned villager looked down at Sumitra's hands, and her fingers were bending back so hard it almost looked like they might break going in the other direction. And then this villager, before asking any more questions, looked up at Sumitra's face, and her eyes had rolled back into the back of her skull, and she had begun grinding her teeth so hard that it was making this loud cracking sound with every movement of her jaw side to side. And so this villager was totally terrified and backed up for a second. And right as they did, Sumitra's baby, who was still strapped to Sumitra's chest, began hysterically crying. And so the combination of Sumitra's baby crying and these other couple of villagers who were staring at Sumitra, who was standing there in this very grotesque pose, attracted the eyes of other nearby villagers. And soon there was a crowd of people just standing there looking at Sumitra, not sure what to do. And then just as suddenly as Sumitra had fallen into this trance, it stopped. And Sumitra, she kind of shook her head. She fluttered her eyes and she looked around and then suddenly became aware that her son is hysterically crying, and also there is this crowd of people all around her. She has no idea why. And so feeling really embarrassed, but again, not knowing what is going on, Sumitra quickly picked up her water bucket. She held her son and hustled out of the crowd of people and made her way into town where she would get water. When Sumitra came back from the well and was back near her hut, she did not tell anyone about what had happened on the way to the well. Frankly, she could not really remember what happened, and so Sumitra told herself that whatever happened on the trail to the well, that trance she fell into, it had to be a one-time thing, likely brought on by stress and sleeplessness from having a new baby. But a few weeks later, it happened again, and this time, the trance lasted quite a bit longer. Sumitra's father-in-law had walked into their kitchen and found Sumitra standing there totally rigid with her hands kind of bending backwards and her eyes rolled back in her skull. And he would tell her later on that he had shaken her and tried to wake her up, but he could not for almost 10 minutes. And then when she had snapped out of it, she had no memory and had no idea what happened. By May of 1985, so roughly 5 months after her first trance, Sumitra was falling into these bizarre spells nearly every day, and they were lasting hours at a time. And even more bizarre, lately during Sumitra's trances, she would begin to speak, and the things she said were totally strange. Typically, she would bark out cries for help. She would say her head was being crushed and someone needed to help her. And then suddenly her voice would drop down to a whisper and she would say, "All I can see is darkness." Sumitra's family would contact the local medicine man who would come out and examine Sumitra, but he could not figure out what was wrong with her. Besides her trances, there seemed to be absolutely nothing wrong with her. She was the picture of good health. And then on July 16th, 1985, so roughly 6 months into these trances, Sumitra would fall into another trance while she was cooking. And during this trance, she would speak. Except when she spoke, she was very calm and she just said, "In 3 days, I am going to die." By this point, Sumitra was terrified of whatever was happening to her, and she was totally exhausted, and so was her family. Sumitra had stopped caring for her son, who was now about 8 months old, because she was afraid that at any moment she could fall into a trance and accidentally hurt him. And so her mother-in-law had basically become the boy's mother. And also Sumitra's husband, who was the primary breadwinner for the family, was forced to stop traveling for work and just stay home and help out with Sumitra and his son. Finally, on July 19th, 1985, so this was the day that in her trance, Sumitra had predicted she would die. On that day, Sumitra woke up and made a very conscious effort not to do anything that could potentially harm her. She did not cook because she did not want to be near flames. She did not walk near anything with any sort of ledge she could fall off. She did not even walk downstairs for the same reason. She also kept a very safe distance from her son in order to make sure he was safe. And by late afternoon that day, Sumitra was just fine, and there was no sign that anything bad was going to happen to her, and so she and her family began to relax. As Sumitra's mother-in-law began making dinner, Sumitra decided to go outside and get some fresh air. And when she got out there, she saw one of her close friends across the road. And so she waved to her, and as her friend cheerfully began walking closer to Sumitra to say hello, Sumitra suddenly froze. Her eyes went back in her skull. Her hands became rigid, and she fell into one of her trances. And so this friend, like everyone else in the village, had become quite accustomed to seeing Sumitra in these trances. And so really, the friend was not that concerned when she saw Sumitra doing this. But then Sumitra began doing something in her trance that this friend had never seen before. Sumitra, who normally had her hands by her side during these trances, she began raising her hands up till they reached her forehead, and then wildly Sumitra began clawing at something right above her head. And as she did, her breathing became very loud and labored. And so this friend, feeling suddenly so concerned for Sumitra, rushed over. But when she got right next to Sumitra, there was nothing she could do. Sumitra was just clawing at the sky, breathing really heavily. And then suddenly Sumitra stopped, and she put her hands down by her side, and she went back to this rigid pose. And then out of Sumitra's mouth came this horrible, low, rattling moan sound. It was just a constant sound that came out of her. And it got deeper and deeper and deeper until Sumitra's voice kind of cracked. And then suddenly Sumitra went totally still. And when this happened, Sumitra's friend, who was right next to her, realized Sumitra, even though she was standing upright, she was not breathing at all. It was like she was a statue. And so this friend began screaming for help. And so Sumitra's in-laws and her husband and other villagers who heard this cry, they came running outside and they quickly circled around Sumitra. And then a few minutes later, the medicine man arrived. He broke through the circle, went right up to Sumitra and began checking her out. He checked her pulse. He checked her heartbeat. He kind of looked inside of her mouth, he looked in her eyes, and then after a minute he stepped back and he just said, "She is dead." Sumitra's husband fell to his knees, and Sumitra's mother-in-law, who was carrying Sumitra's son, began crying. All the while, Sumitra's body still remained totally upright and rigid in the middle of all these people, with her hands tight by her side and her eyes rolled back and her face frozen in what looked like a silent scream. Eventually, the medicine man and Sumitra's father-in-law stepped forward and lowered Sumitra's frozen, rigid body onto the ground on her back, and they closed her eyes. There was no hospital to take Sumitra's body to or official to call about her death. And in this village at this time, it was very important for both religious and public health reasons to take care of the body very quickly. And what that looked like was the villagers would work together to perform the Hindu death rituals. And then afterwards, they would cremate the body, which is a process of burning the body until all you have left is the ashes. And so as Sumitra's body lay still rigid on her back right near her home, her family and the villagers began making preparations for her funeral. Sumitra's mother-in-law and some women from the village began scrubbing down Sumitra's body, as well as putting essential oils on her face, and other villagers who were not a part of that went off to find wood for a fire. The villagers were not talking much, and a lot of the women were crying, but it was not just grief they were feeling. It was also fear. They all knew about Sumitra's trances. They happened all the time for months. But what the villagers could not wrap their heads around was the idea that during one of these trances, Sumitra had accurately predicted her own death. And so now the villagers could not help but think that dark forces were at play here, that maybe Sumitra was possessed. And now whatever had possessed her and killed her is somewhere in the village. And so that night as the sun started to go down, normally kids would be out playing in the village, but their parents said, "No, come inside. It is not safe outside." And so for the most part, the only people who were outside that night were the women who were still cleaning and prepping Sumitra's body for her funeral. And at some point, one of the women who was doing this was brushing out Sumitra's hair. And as she did that, she suddenly stopped and she backed up and screamed and pointed at Sumitra. And then the other women all around Sumitra's body, they looked over at what this person was pointing at. And they too saw it and screamed, and everyone began scrambling to try to get away from Sumitra as fast as possible. What all these terrified women were seeing was that Sumitra, her eyes were closed, but her eyes were darting left and right under her eyelids, so her eyelids were kind of fluttering, and then suddenly Sumitra's chest filled with air. And then she breathed out a long, loud exhale. and then she opened her eyes and she sat bolt upright and began looking around. And the other women who were terrified, they are looking at her, and they were struck by how completely healthy and normal Sumitra now looked. Even though for the past 45 minutes she did not have a heartbeat and was totally pale and looked completely dead. Sumitra wiped the essential oils from her face. And then she stood up, and as she did, the medicine man, he had heard all the commotion and ran over, and he ran to Sumitra and kind of assisted her and got her to stand on her feet because she was a little bit wobbly. And then the medicine man performed a checkup on Sumitra, checking her heartbeat, her pulse. He looked at her mouth, he looked at her eyes, and then he asked Sumitra, how are you feeling? And Sumitra said, I am okay. And then the medicine man, he kind of turned to face this now huge crowd of onlooking villagers. And the medicine man had a big smile on his face, and he said, you all have just witnessed a miracle. Sumitra's back from the dead. Sumitra's husband and her in-laws were too shocked to say anything or really even react. But then suddenly, Sumitra's husband was overcome with joy, and he ran forward to hug Sumitra. But as Sumitra turned and saw him coming towards her, she backed up suddenly and put her hands out to protect herself from her husband. And immediately, the medicine man, he kind of stepped in between the husband and Sumitra. And he patted the husband on the shoulder and said, she has been through something very traumatic. You need to give her time and space to recover. And everybody in the village who saw this happen, they were accustomed to whenever Sumitra fell into one of her trances when she came out of them, she oftentimes was a little bit confused. And so they all just kind of assumed that this is what was happening, but on a bigger scale. This is a really intense trance they have seen. But she is just confused. She will be okay soon. And so the villagers dispersed, and the medicine man assisted Sumitra back into her hut. And he got her in her bed where she fell asleep, and then afterwards, the medicine man reassured Sumitra's husband and her in-laws that Sumitra, when she woke up, she would likely be just fine, but he would come by and he would do another thorough medical exam on her just to make sure. And the next morning, when Sumitra woke up, she did seem a lot better. When she left her bedroom, she seemed far less confused than she had been the night before. But as soon as Sumitra saw her husband and her in-laws, she got so scared she just bolted from her hut and started running away. And so the medicine man, who had just come by to do his thorough checkup, he saw her take off. And so he began chasing her, as well as Sumitra's husband and father-in-law. They took off after Sumitra. And finally, when Sumitra's husband caught up to Sumitra, he grabbed her by the arm to stop her. And Sumitra ripped her arm away from him and she said, "How dare you touch another man's wife?" And as the husband kind of ushered Sumitra back towards their house, she continued to say, "You are not my family. This is not my home." And then finally, Sumitra's husband and the medicine man had to literally drag Sumitra to get her to go back inside the hut. And as they dragged her inside, she kept screaming that her name was Shiva Tripathi and her in-laws had killed her. Over the next couple of days, the medicine man and Sumitra's family tried everything they could to try to snap her out of what seemed like a really long trance, but nothing they did worked. It seemed like Sumitra had just kind of lost her mind. Sumitra began refusing to touch her beloved son and instead would demand that someone bring her Ringu and Tinku. But when no one knew who or what she was talking about, Sumitra would just get furious. Sumitra had never gone to school and so did not know how to write, but now suddenly, in this new trance that she was in, Sumitra would go inside of her bedroom and write these long, totally unhinged-sounding letters to total strangers, asking them to please come take her home. And when she was not doing that, she was typically outside in the courtyard looking at a scar on her foot, wondering how she got it. Sumitra also began wrapping her sari, which is a type of dress fabric, in a new and strange way around her head. She also refused to eat off of any dishes that her family had previously used, and her voice began to sound different. It was higher pitched and much faster. And the way she spoke was always so rude. And so eventually, Sumitra's husband and her in-laws and everybody in the village just kind of resigned themselves to the fact that when Sumitra had not had a heartbeat for 45 minutes when she died, during that time she likely suffered serious brain damage, or at a minimum, when she kind of came back from the dead, she suffered some kind of psychological break. And so that was why she was acting the way she was. And soon people just stopped trying to break Sumitra out of this trance she was in, and instead they all focused on just trying to keep her from running away or hurting herself. And then one day on October 20th, 1985, so 3 months after Sumitra had died for 45 minutes, Sumitra's family heard a knock on their front door. When Sumitra's husband went to the door and opened it up, he saw there was this older gentleman standing there wearing a suit and nice shoes, standing several feet back from the door as if he was kind of shy but felt compelled to knock on the door. Now, right off the bat, this man looked totally out of place to Sumitra's husband. Nobody in this village wore suits or nice shoes. In fact, most people, including Sumitra and her family, did not even wear shoes. But even stranger than what this man was wearing was what he was clutching against his chest. He had this huge, leather-bound book with gold trim around the edges that he was holding on to very tightly as if it was very important. And so finally, this strange man, who was visibly nervous and rocking back and forth, began to speak. But his voice was so low, Sumitra's husband had to lean forward just to hear him. The man said his name was Ram Tripathi, and he wanted to know if there was a young woman living in this home who had recently begun acting differently. Sumitra's husband had no idea who Ram Tripathi was. He did not know this guy, he certainly did not know where he came from, but what was going through his head was, how is this stranger who is dressed in a funny way, who has got this weird book, how is he aware of the issues my wife is having? And so after a long pause, Sumitra's husband just kind of looks Ram Tripathi up and down a couple of times and then says, "Wait right here, I will be right back." And then Sumitra's husband turned around. He walked through the hut into Sumitra's bedroom, and kind of matter-of-factly, he said to Sumitra, who was sitting there writing another letter, that there was a strange man outside named Ram Tripathi, and he is asking about you. Sumitra's husband expected Sumitra to just turn and look at him with a blank stare like she had been doing the last few days. But this time, she turned and looked up at him with a huge smile on her face, and then she leapt up and ran to the front door and leapt into the arms of Ram Tripathi. And Ram Tripathi, he was kind of taken aback, still holding his book, not really reacting to what Sumitra was doing. And at some point, Sumitra leans in and whispers something into Ram Tripathi's ear. And Ram Tripathi, he reacted to it very negatively. He kind of looked up at her and looked over at Sumitra's husband like something was wrong. But Sumitra's husband could not tell what Sumitra had said, and so the whole situation made no sense to Sumitra's husband. And apparently, it also made no sense to Ram Tripathi. And so pretty quickly, Ram Tripathi kind of pushed Sumitra off of him and took a few steps back and looked at Sumitra and said, "What is your name?" And Sumitra is now looking at Ram Tripathi with a look of anger and betrayal on her face, and she says, "My name is Shiva Tripathi." Ram Tripathi, after hearing this, did not respond and instead just kind of gestured over to a low wall just outside of their house for he and Sumitra to go sit down on. And so he walked over and Sumitra followed him. They sat down and Sumitra's husband, he walked over, but he stayed a couple of feet back standing up. And once Ram Tripathi was sitting down, he lowered his big leather-bound book, and he opened it up, and inside were all these photographs. And right away, Ram Tripathi pointed at one of the pictures which contained a bunch of people in it. And he turned to Sumitra and he said, "Can you identify who is in this photo?" And Sumitra, she looked at the photo and immediately began rattling off names that were all correct. These are people that Sumitra's husband, he has looked over and he has got no idea who the people are in that photo. And so after Sumitra correctly identifies that photo, Ram Tripathi turns the page. He picks out another photo and he says, "Can you identify who is in this photo?" And again, Sumitra, one by one, would name correctly all the people in the photo. And then finally, Ram Tripathi took a sigh, and he flipped the page one more time and he pointed to one particular picture which contained one person, and he looked at Sumitra and he said, "Do you know who this is?" And Sumitra, she would look over at the photo, and instead of immediately saying the name, she paused and she kind of began to breathe heavy and she seemed kind of angry. And then she looked at Ram Tripathi and she said, "I know who that is. That is my sister-in-law, and she killed me by hitting me over the head with a brick." And at this, Ram Tripathi dropped his book on the ground, and he turned and embraced Sumitra as hard and as intensely as she had when she had run out and leapt into his arms. And he and Sumitra, they hugged and cried for a long time. And then finally, when they separated, Ram Tripathi turned to Sumitra's husband, who is still just standing there totally bewildered, and he tells him, "Let us go inside and I will explain everything." Once Ram Tripathi was inside with Sumitra and her family, he told them an unbelievable story about a woman named Shiva Tripathi. Shiva Tripathi was, of course, the name that Sumitra for months had been saying was her own. But over those few months, her family had just assumed that that name meant nothing and that what she was saying was nonsense because of her brain injury. But Ram Tripathi would tell them that Shiva Tripathi was the name of a young woman who lived in a city none of them had ever heard before, located about 60 miles away from their village. He would tell them that Shiva was a very wealthy woman who was college-educated, and she had 2 young sons. And it would turn out that Shiva's youngest child was born almost on the same day that Sumitra's child was born in December of 1984. But unlike Sumitra, who after the birth of her child felt like her life got so much better, she loved her family, she was excited about the future, for Shiva, it was the exact opposite. When her first child arrived, it was like her life got worse and worse and worse. Shiva's in-laws had grown to hate her. They did not like that she was so well educated, and they hated the family she came from. And so by early 1985, when by this point Sumitra was regularly falling into those trances with her eyes rolling back and her teeth gnashing, the tension and fighting in Shiva's home 60 miles away was reaching an almost unbearable level. Shiva began writing these long letters that she would send to her family far away, where she would detail waking up almost every night with nightmares, screaming. And in May of 1985, which is when Sumitra began speaking during her trances, Shiva got into the biggest fight she had ever gotten into with her in-laws about attending a family wedding. And on the night of May 18, 1985, Shiva's neighbors in her city saw Shiva's in-laws literally carrying Shiva's body, which appeared to be unconscious, as they walked along the railroad tracks. When these neighbors ran up and asked if everything was okay with Shiva, Shiva's in-laws just said, "Oh, she is sick and we are taking her to the hospital." Now, it was nighttime. There were no lights around, and so it was really dark, and these neighbors could not get a good look at Shiva to see, what was going on with her. And so, even though they thought this was very strange, they decided not to say anything. The next morning, Shiva's dead body was found lying on the train tracks right near the train station. And so someone raised the alarm. And before long, Shiva's uncle and sister ran to the train station. And when they got there and saw Shiva on the tracks, they also saw Shiva's in-laws were already there. And when they spoke to Shiva's in-laws, they told the uncle and the sister that it looks like Shiva must have jumped in front of a train to commit suicide. But the uncle and sister are looking down at Shiva's body, and there appeared to be really no markings, bruises, cuts of any kind on her body that you would expect from getting hit by a train. Except Shiva did have a very big mark on her head. Later on, the uncle and sister would say it looked like something had bashed Shiva's head in. Shiva's in-laws would immediately cremate Shiva's body before Shiva's actual family could stop them. And the police in this area were not good at investigating crime. So when Shiva's in-laws went to them and said, "Yep, she jumped in front of a train, she committed suicide, but we do not have a body because we already cremated her," the police just accepted it. Shiva's father was convinced that Shiva had been murdered, but he did not have a way to prove it until Sumitra appeared to die on July 19, 1985, and then came back to life claiming to be Shiva. Shiva's father had heard a rumor about some girl in a village 60 miles away claiming to be his dead daughter. Now, at first, Shiva's father did not believe this, but eventually he decided he would go to the village and test this girl to see if maybe it was true. And so, on October 20th, 1985, Shiva's father put on his best suit and his nicest shoes. He brought his leather-bound photo book, and he headed to Sumitra's village and knocked on her hut. Ram Tripathi was Shiva's dad. When Sumitra at first ran outside and leapt onto Ram Tripathi and hugged him, and then whispered something into his ear, which Sumitra's husband saw happening but could not hear what she said, and then Ram Tripathi, when he heard what she whispered, he kind of recoiled and acted angry for a second. What Sumitra was saying was "Papa." In the moment, Ram Tripathi, who was not convinced Sumitra was his daughter, felt like this is a horrible, elaborate hoax, and it needs to stop. But then Sumitra correctly identified 15 people in his leather-bound photo album, including the sister-in-law who she said killed her. And even more convincing than that was that Sumitra knew how Shiva had been killed by getting smashed over the head with a brick. This was a question that Ram Tripathi had never heard the answer to before. And at that point, Ram Tripathi believed that this must be his daughter's reincarnated spirit inside of Sumitra. And so that was when he dropped the book and gave her a big hug. This story is considered to be one of the most credible reincarnation stories ever recorded. Scientists from the University of Virginia in America actually went to India to study Sumitra and interview everybody involved, and they concluded that this was not a hoax. They said that Sumitra had most likely either been possessed by or reincarnated as Shiva Tripathi. The change in Sumitra's voice that her family noticed was the same accent that Shiva had. It was very urban and educated. The strange new way that Sumitra wrapped her sari on her head was the same way that Shiva did. Sumitra was rude to her family and refused to eat off the same dishes as them because she believed she was actually a very wealthy woman who was for some reason being forced to live in this poor person's hut. And when Sumitra asked for Tinku and Ringu, those were nicknames that Shiva had given her two sons. And all those seemingly unhinged letters that Sumitra had written and fired off to random strangers were in fact sent to various members of Shiva's family. After Shiva's father, Ram Tripathi, brought Sumitra's story to the police would actually investigate this case, and they would charge some members of Shiva's family. But ultimately, Sumitra's testimony was deemed unacceptable for court, and so the case was never officially solved. As for Shiva's in-laws, they have always denied killing her. Sumitra lived the entire rest of her life as Shiva, and Shiva's real parents accepted her as their daughter. Sumitra also came to accept her son and raised her son with her husband in their little village until she died in 1998. Now, let us turn our attention to the dark, cobblestone streets of early 20th century Italy, where a mother's love took a turn so horrifying and macabre that it remains one of the most chilling cases in modern criminal history. In the late summer of 1930, Raphael Pansardi and his wife, Leonarda Cianciulli, moved with their 4 young kids to a little town in northern Italy called Correggio. A terrible earthquake had destroyed the family's previous village and killed nearly all of their neighbors, and so this family was feeling very lucky to be alive. But when they arrived in Correggio, they really had nothing, and were hoping that, the people of this town will just be very welcoming and generous and kind of help them get set up again. And the people of this town did exactly that. Correggio was this beautiful place inside of a fertile valley where people lived in these cottages surrounded by rice fields and mulberry trees. And the people who lived there were very tight-knit and looked after each other and cooked for each other and had parties together. I mean, this was a real community. And so when Raphael and Leonarda arrived, the townspeople immediately found them this cute little cottage by a stream with a whitewashed front door and a beautiful stone hearth for cooking. And there was an attached storefront on this cottage that they were giving them. And then on top of that, once the family had moved in, the family's new neighbors helped get Raphael a job. And they also helped Leonarda set up the attached storefront that was part of their cottage so she could sell her homemade soap bars out of the shop. And so very quickly, the family just completely fell in love with Correggio, especially 36-year-old Leonarda. Losing her home and her previous neighbors in that terrible earthquake had been a tragedy on an epic scale, but it was far from the first tragedy that Leonarda had been forced to live through. Leonarda had been born into poverty. Her mother had actually come from a very wealthy family, but they had cut Leonarda's mom off when she became pregnant with Leonarda. And so when Leonarda's mom gave birth to her, she blamed Leonarda for their poverty and all of their problems, and so she beat her relentlessly. And then on top of that, Leonarda's father died when she was very young, and so she was stuck at home being abused constantly by her mother. When Leonarda was 21, she met Raphael and fell in love with him, and he was a very kind and gentle man. He really made a very strong first impression on anyone who met him. But when Leonarda went to her mother and introduced Raphael to her and said, "I am going to marry this man, I love him," her mother flew into a rage and then literally cursed Leonarda. She actually, out loud, muttered the spell and then told Leonarda that because of the spell, Leonarda would have evil following her forever. Now, of course, Leonarda was very used to her mother's terrible behavior, and so she did not actually think she was at risk of this curse affecting her life in any way. But not long after actually marrying Raphael, Leonarda began to see evidence that this curse might actually be real. It started with Leonarda having these sudden fits of seizures for no particular reason. And then, Leonarda, every time she got pregnant, she would miscarry and lose the baby. And so feeling really sad and desperate because all she wanted was a family, Leonarda actually went to a fortune teller in hopes that they would tell her that in the future, her life got better, not worse. Which to Leonarda meant, the curse was not real if her life improves. But after this fortune teller took Leonarda's hands and studied her palms, she looked up at Leonarda and gave her grave news. She said, "Leonarda, you are going to have living children, but they are all going to die young, and I see a prison and an insane asylum in your future." This experience totally shocked Leonarda and confirmed for her that her mother's curse must be real. And sure enough, over the following years, Leonarda and Raphael would go on to have 14 living children, and 10 of them would die when they were babies or toddlers. And so, by the time Leonarda had arrived in Correggio with her family in 1930, she was absolutely petrified that her last 4 precious children would die because of this curse. And so, in order to keep her kids safe, she basically never let them out of her sight. And then she also made sure they always adhered to these strange rules and beliefs that Leonarda had come up with about good and evil that were designed to somehow protect the kids from this curse. But the incredible show of generosity and support and kindness that Leonarda and her family had experienced when they arrived in Correggio had really done something to Leonarda. In fact, it really kind of changed the way she viewed the world. Suddenly, she was less concerned with this curse and how to protect her family from it, and instead, she was just kind of content. She felt safe. She felt happy. The women in the town loved Leonarda and always came by the house to say hi to her and eat some of the amazing tea cakes that she would make. And also, Leonarda had become best friends with this woman named Virginia, who was a former opera singer from Milan who was very elegant and beautiful, and every time she went to a dinner party, she would invite Leonarda. And also, Leonarda and her family were becoming financially stable, really for the first time ever. Leonarda's soap shop that she ran out of their cottage was really successful. People came from all around to buy her soaps because nobody could make them like she could. And Raphael's job as a clerk was very steady, and he too was becoming well respected in town. And so because of how well this transition to Correggio had been, at some point Leonarda made a promise both to herself and to the universe that instead of focusing all of her time and energy on this curse, which had plagued her whole life, instead, she was going to focus on helping the people of Correggio any way she could because they had done so much for her. And that is exactly what Leonarda did, but in a kind of ironic way. Because of the fear Leonarda had for her mother's curse, she had gone to that fortune teller many years ago. And even though the news she got when she saw the fortune teller was horrible, Leonarda had left that experience kind of fascinated with the art of fortune telling and magic and sorcery. It just really appealed to her, and so now that Leonarda was running this very successful soap shop out of her house, there were all these people coming from far and wide that would ask to barter for her soaps. Bartering is like trading one item for another item versus paying for something outright with money. And so Leonarda began bartering with these travelers whenever they had books about fortune-telling, about magic, about sorcery, about how to make potions, about the occult. And after reading through all of these books and learning as much as she could, Leonarda, in addition to selling her soaps, began offering fortune-telling services to the people of Correggio. And it would turn out she was really good at predicting the future to the point where people in town basically began going to her for all kinds of advice. She helped women find love. She told farmers what crops to plant. She created these charm bags for people and told them they would protect them. She also began creating these herb potions for people when they got sick. It actually got to the point where people trusted her so much that when they got sick, they did not even go to the doctor. They just went to her. And so very quickly, Leonardo felt very proud of the fact that she had lived up to the promise she had made, both to herself and to the universe, to always help the people of Correggio at every turn. But more than that, Leonardo was starting to think that this newfound sense of purpose and happiness she was getting in helping the people of Correggio through her various services had finally broken her mother's curse. By 1939, Leonardo and her family had been living in Correggio very happily for almost 10 years. And at the time, Leonardo's oldest son, Giuseppe, was 17 years old. Giuseppe was tall, he was handsome, he had dark hair, he had dark eyes, and all the girls loved him. And Giuseppe and Leonardo had always had a very close relationship. Every day, Giuseppe would come home and he and his mom would sit in the kitchen and they would chat for a while and eat some of her tea cakes. But now in 1939, when Giuseppe was 17, he started to act a little bit different. He would come home, and instead of going into the kitchen to sit with Leonardo, he would just go straight to his room and shut the door. And when Leonardo or Raphael would ask him, hey, is everything okay? Giuseppe would get very defensive and say he was fine and to please just leave him alone. But to Leonardo, it seemed really obvious that her son was not fine. And she thought, maybe he has some sort of secret he is keeping, and that is what is making him act this way. He is hurting on the inside, but he cannot share it with the world. But Leonardo had no idea what the secret might be. And then one day, late that same year, Leonardo was walking through town when one of her neighbors came up to her and said, "Hey, are you aware that your son Giuseppe has signed up for the military and he is leaving for training in just a few months?" Leonardo had not heard about this. People were talking a lot about World War II, which had just started around this time, but Leonardo had never considered that her precious son would go off to fight in that war. But now Leonardo realized that Giuseppe's recent strange behavior suddenly made sense. This was the secret he was keeping. He had joined the military, and he had not told his family. Leonardo turned around and went straight home. She went right into her bedroom, shut the door, and she just sobbed. To her, it felt like her mother's curse was back, and now her precious son was going to go off into the war and he was going to die unless she found a way to combat this evil that was now following her again. For the next several days, Leonardo did not open up her soap shop. She did not come downstairs. She just stayed locked in her bedroom and read through all of her books about magic and sorcery and the occult, looking for some sort of solution for how to fight this curse. And finally, she figured out what she had to do. She read that if she gave something beautiful to the universe would reward her, and in Leonardo's mind, that reward would be sparing her son. And so Leonardo decided that the most beautiful thing she could offer the universe would be to help the people of Correggio, which she was already doing. But in her mind, she thought she could really ramp up her efforts and really try to change people's lives, and she thought if she could do that, the universe was sure to notice, and it would save her son's life. Leonardo decided that the first person she would really go above and beyond to help inside of Correggio was a woman named Faustina. Faustina, who was in her 70s, was desperate to get married. But to many people in town, including Leonardo, she seemed kind of beyond help. She was totally antisocial. She was awkward, and just given her age, it seemed like marriage was just not in the cards for her. But this is where Leonardo thought she could step in and change everything for Faustina. She would find her a husband. So Leonardo reached out to Faustina and told her about a friend of hers, a man who lived in a city to the north who was also alone in his old age, and who was likely looking for marriage, and she could set them up if Faustina was interested. And so Faustina was immediately interested and wanted to meet this guy. But Leonardo did tell her that, this guy, the reason he is not married is he is kind of difficult to be around. He is kind of a jerk, but he has got a wonderful heart. He means well. I think he would be a great fit for you. And so again, Faustina is like, great, I want to meet him, I want to marry him, I am ready. And then finally, the day came when Faustina actually went to this other town and met this guy in person, and they fell in love. And Faustina just moved right in with him. And before long, she was sending happy postcards back to Correggio, telling everyone about how happy she was and how thankful she was for Leonardo's help in setting them up. And so, Leonardo was obviously thrilled, not only for her friend's happiness, but also it really felt like she had checked the box in terms of really going above and beyond to help someone in Correggio in an effort to get the universe to spare her son. But her son was still a couple of months away from leaving for training, and Leonardo, she is very superstitious, and she is thinking, okay, I do not know if that was enough to get the universe to save my son, and so I need to find somebody else I can help. So in September of 1940, Leonardo began her next good deed project with another woman in town. She was a widow in her 50s named Francesca. She had worked as a teacher, but when her husband got sick, she quit her job. And then when her husband ultimately died, she was left with nothing. So Leonardo reached out to Francesca and told her that she, Leonardo, would be willing to reach out to her own mother's rich family to see if maybe they had a job they could finesse for Francesca. Now, of course, Leonarda was not excited about talking to her mother's family, who had disowned her mother and had shown no interest in Leonarda. But Leonarda wanted to do this for Francesca and for the sake of her son and getting the universe to notice what she was doing. And so sure enough, Leonarda would reach out to her mother's family, and they were remarkably open to the idea, and they got a job for Francesca in Switzerland. And so eventually, Francesca jetted off to Switzerland, and then a couple of days later, she was sending postcards back to Correggio saying how happy she was and how thankful she was for Leonarda's help. And so again, Leonarda was so happy about this outcome, both because she cared about Francesca and also because this was yet another kind of check in the box of her good deeds that the universe was going to notice that, in turn, would save her son. But again, after Francesca did not need any more help, Leonarda found herself looking at her son who was getting closer and closer to leaving for training, and she would think to herself, have I done enough to protect him? Have I really stopped this curse from killing him after he leaves? And Leonarda eventually decided that, no, she had not done enough. She needed to do at least one more really big good deed for someone in this town. And who better to help than her best friend Virginia, the former opera singer? Leonarda knew from all her talks with Virginia that Virginia really missed living in the big city and going to the opera house. And so Leonarda reached out to Virginia and said, you know what, I can reach out to my mother's rich family, and maybe they can find a job for you in a big city if you are interested. And so Virginia was like, wow, yes, I would love that. That is an amazing opportunity. And so Leonarda again would contact her mother's rich family, and again they came through, finding this job as a social planner for this very rich guy in Florence, Italy, who often funded plays and operas. And so this job was perfect for Virginia. When Leonarda told Virginia about this opportunity, Virginia cried tears of joy. After packing up all of her things, Virginia made a stop at Leonarda's house to say goodbye and thank you. And the two women would hug and laugh and cry. They would drink wine together. And then finally, when it was time for Virginia to go, even though Leonarda was very sad, she was also quite happy because finally she felt like this good deed was enough to get the universe to spare her son. However, Leonarda, being a very superstitious person, did have one more little thing she wanted to do with Giuseppe before he left for the military. And this little thing was her, Leonarda, bathing her son, her 18-year-old son, with a particular bar of soap. And then she also wanted to feed him a special kind of tea cake that she was going to make. The soap and the tea cake had these special herbs and ingredients and different things she had pulled from her books of magic and the occult, and they would kind of form like a protective barrier both outside and inside of Giuseppe. So on the same night that Virginia headed off to Florence, when Giuseppe came home, Leonarda approached him and said, I want to give you this bath, and I want to feed you these tea cakes. And Giuseppe was not remotely enthused at the idea of having his mom bathe him. He is 18, but he knew she was highly superstitious, she seemed pretty emotional about this, and it just seemed like it was extremely important to her, and so he said, okay. And so Leonarda washed her son with this special kind of magic soap, and then she also gave him the tea cakes. And then afterward, even though Giuseppe was really annoyed by what he had just been asked to do, Leonarda was so happy she was practically floating. She felt like she had done everything she could possibly do, and now she could just relax because her son was safe. But soon, Leonarda would learn that that was not actually true. A few days after giving her son the magical bath and magical tea cakes, the police showed up at the front door of Leonarda's house. And when she opened the door and saw the police, she asked what was going on, and the police would say to her, hey, the 3 women that you supposedly helped that left town recently, they have all been reported missing by their families. They do not know where they are. And so Leonarda, she was totally shocked by this. And she said, no, that is not possible. I write to them all the time. I get postcards that come in very regularly from all of them. And then Leonarda went and got the postcards and showed the police like, look, I am talking to them. How could they possibly be missing? And so the police, they would look at these letters and they would agree with Leonarda that it is pretty strange that she would be getting these very authentic seeming letters from these women if these women were also missing. And so eventually, the police would leave and they would tell Leonarda that they would be in touch if they needed anything. And then over the next couple of days, Leonarda was very concerned about these 3 women, but she received numerous postcards from these women over those several days, and all of these postcards were totally normal seeming. And so Leonarda was fairly confident that whatever was going on with the police had to have been a mix-up, and she would not be hearing from them again. But a couple of weeks later, the police did come back to Leonarda's house. Except this time, they did not knock. They just barged right in. After the police had spoken with Leonarda that first time, they did some digging on these letters that she was receiving, and they managed to trace them all back to their start point. And it turned out all of these letters from all 3 of these women were originating from one place. It was this little town to the north of Correggio. And when police went to this little town, they discovered that these letters that were starting in this little town were all being mailed by the same person. And they got a physical description of this person who apparently was pretending to be these three women. And the description was of a tall, handsome young man with dark hair and dark eyes. It was Giuseppe. After the police barged into Leonardo's house, they went straight to Giuseppe's room where they accused him of murdering those three women. And then they hauled him out of the house and brought him to the station to question him about where he dumped the bodies. When the last police officer left Leonardo's house, Leonardo walked outside and just stood there wondering what she was going to do. It was like she had done everything in her power to protect her son from this curse, but somehow this curse she knew had done this to her son. And so now she knew there was only one thing she could do. Without saying anything to her husband, she went inside, she got her things, and she began making her way to the police station. At this point in her life, Leonardo looked much older than her actual age of 46. She had very gray hair, her face was very wrinkled, and she was stooped over, and she was always carrying these charm bags and magical potions and little stick figures that she claimed protected her family. And so her overall appearance when she wandered into the police station was that of a very frail old woman who was also very strange. And so Leonardo hobbled her way up to the front desk, and in a trembling voice, she asked the attendant if she could speak to the detective who was working on her son's case. And then a moment later, she was led into an interview room where she was told to wait. And then a little while later, the lead detective walked into the room. He sat down across the table from Leonardo and he said, "What can I do for you?" And immediately, Leonardo said, "My son Giuseppe is innocent." And the detective, when he heard this, he was not remotely surprised. In fact, this is fully what he expected this conversation was going to be. He knew Leonardo loved her son very much, and of course, she was going to say he was innocent. This is what parents typically did in cases like this. But the detective decided he would not try to stop her. He would just let this very distraught mother kind of talk for a bit. He would tell her that he would follow up on whatever she was saying, and then he would drive her back home. But this detective was not expecting the things that would come out of Leonardo's mouth over the next couple of hours. In fact, her story about why Giuseppe was innocent was so shocking and so bizarre that the detective outright said, "I do not believe you. I do not believe this. This cannot be true." And then other officers were called in to listen to her story to see if they believed it, and they too said, "This does not seem real." But the police would follow up on the details she gave, and it all checked out. It would turn out back in late 1939, on the day that Faustina, the first woman that Leonardo pledged to help in order to get the universe to save her son, when Faustina was set to go north and meet her future husband, Faustina stopped by Leonardo's house to say bye. And when she was in Leonardo's house, something very unexpected happened. When Faustina walked into Leonardo's kitchen where Leonardo was, Faustina was so excited about meeting her potential future husband that her hands were shaking, and she was smiling ear to ear, and so Leonardo said to Faustina, "Hey, you need to calm down." And so she handed Faustina a glass of wine. And so Faustina took the wine and she had a couple of sips of wine. And right away, Faustina started feeling dizzy. And before long, she was grabbing the table just to keep from falling over. It would turn out the wine was poisoned by Leonardo. And so Faustina, she is kind of looking up at Leonardo, and Leonardo is looking down at her, and she has got an axe in one of her hands, and she says to Faustina, "I am so sorry." And then she winds up, and she strikes Faustina in the chest with the axe and lodges it in her chest, and so she lets go of it, expecting Faustina to die. She does not. Faustina is just standing there with an axe in her chest, and so Leonardo grabbed the handle of the axe, she pulled it out of her chest, and then began wailing on her head over and over and over again until Faustina did fall to the ground dead. Then Leonardo lit a fire under her big metal pot on the stove, and then she cut Faustina's body into 9 pieces. She drained the blood out of the body into a bucket. And then she chucked those 9 pieces into the pot on the stove and began to mix them with caustic soda, which is a powerful dissolving agent that is used to make soap. And then she boiled the ingredients, her body parts, and this caustic soda for hours. Faustina's body slowly turned into this horrible black mush inside of this pot. And Leonardo was watching this the whole time, and she just had a look of total disappointment as this was happening. And then at some point, she just took the pot off the stove and dumped the ingredients, Faustina's body, down the septic tank. And then Leonardo waited for Faustina's blood that she had dumped out to coagulate, which means it became semi-solid. And then she heated it up in the oven and then ground it into flour. And she would use that flour to make tea cakes, which she fed to her friends the next day, as well as her son Giuseppe. Leonardo also asked her son to mail some letters for her from the little town to the north where Faustina had supposedly gone. These letters, of course, were written by Leonardo, pretending to be Faustina, to give the impression that she was still alive and well. And Giuseppe, when he was told to go mail these letters, did not think anything of it. He was used to doing errands for his mom. Even though Leonardo basically got away with killing Faustina, her plan for Faustina had not really gone the way Leonardo had hoped. When she boiled Faustina's chopped up body parts and this caustic soda, they did not really mix the way she wanted them to. Leonardo was convinced that the reason for this is because Faustina was too skinny, and so there was not enough fat on her body for the mix to be perfect. So Leonardo had come up with another elaborate story, this time for another woman, Francesca, about that job in Switzerland she got through her mother's rich family. Of course, none of that was true. And when Francesca came by Leonardo's house to say goodbye to her, she was offered a glass of poisoned wine. And after she sipped from it, she became dizzy. And then Leonardo showed up with an axe and hacked Francesca to death. But again, when the body parts and the caustic soda were in the pot on the stove boiling together, they were still not coming together the way Leonardo wanted. And so again, Leonardo, with a look of disgust, just dumped the pot down the septic tank and wound up making tea cakes from Francesca's blood. Then the next day, she fed those tea cakes to her friends, as well as Giuseppe. And she also asked Giuseppe to send a few more letters from up north. These letters were, of course, from Francesca. Still feeling totally unsatisfied with how the last two killings had gone, Leonardo moved on to her third target, her best friend Virginia. And this time, when Virginia came by Leonardo's house to say goodbye, everything went to plan. Leonardo was able to poison Virginia. She killed her with the axe, she chopped her up, she put her in the pot, and this time the 9 chunks of her body mixed beautifully with the caustic soda. And so after adding a few fine perfumes into the pot, Leonardo was finally able to create the thing that she had not been able to create with the other 2 women's bodies, and that was a beautiful, rich, creamy bar of soap. She also again made tea cakes from Virginia's blood. That night, when Giuseppe came home, Leonardo demanded that she be allowed to bathe him with her magic soap, i.e. the soap made from Virginia's body. And so she did that. She scrubbed him with Virginia's body soap, and then while she was doing that, she fed him the tea cakes that were made from Virginia's blood. It would turn out Leonardo did in fact believe that in order to save her son from this curse, she would need to give something beautiful to the universe. And at first, she really had believed that the way to do that was by helping the people of Correggio above and beyond anything she had ever done before. But at some point during her interactions with Faustina, the first woman, Leonardo had decided that, you know what, that was not enough. She really needed to make sure that her son was going to be safe, and so the only way really that Leonardo could guarantee her son would be safe would be if she actually took a life and gave that back to the universe. That would save her son. The reason Leonardo wound up taking 3 lives and not just 1 life is because she also decided that as an extra protective measure, she wanted to make sure that she actually bathed her son literally in the body parts and kind of essence of the life she had taken. And so that is where the idea of the soap came in. However, the first 2 women, their body parts did not mix right, and so she could not turn them into soap. But then Virginia came along, and her body did mix with the caustic soda. And so Leonardo was able to make her soap. She was able to bathe her son with Virginia's body and feed him Virginia's blood. And so in Leonardo's mind, she had done everything she could to protect her son at that point. Leonardo would ultimately be sentenced to 30 years in prison as well as 3 years in an insane asylum, just as the fortune teller had predicted. Leonardo died in 1970 when she was 76 years old. As for her family, they fled Correggio, and 3 of her children changed their names and vanished. And her prized son, Giuseppe, who she had killed to protect, had gone on to join the military and he would go to war. And he either was killed in combat or simply changed his name and vanished as well. Now let us move to the final chapter of our journey, a story of natural horror that struck without warning, leaving an entire valley silent and presenting scientists with one of the most baffling and terrifying environmental investigations ever recorded. Before sunrise on August 22, 1986, a man named Ephraim Che woke up feeling groggy and confused. As he lay in his bed inside of his small mud brick house, perched up on a cliff, he tried to remember what happened the night before. He did not know why, but he knew, something happened last night. I got to remember it. But as he lay there, kind of jogging his memory, he felt like there were holes in his memory, like he could not quite piece together what had happened the day or night before. However, there was one thing he distinctly remembered about the night before, and that was at some point he had heard one really loud boom of thunder outside. And Ephraim, kind of somewhere in the back of his mind, had thought, oh, it is going to rain tonight, and maybe when I wake up it will still be raining. And then Ephraim, no matter how hard he focused, he could not really remember how much time passed after hearing that booming sound and then getting in his bed the night before. But at some point he remembered being in his bed and feeling kind of sick, and that was it. That was his whole memory of the night before. And so that morning, August 22nd, when Ephraim has suddenly woken up feeling confused, he rolled over and he looked out the window right nearby his bed, and he looked outside and he saw the sky was clear and the grass was totally dry. There was no indication that it had rained any time recently. And so Ephraim is thinking to himself, something is definitely off here, but I just cannot get my mind right. And so finally, Ephraim just sits up in his bed. He swings his legs out of his bed onto the ground, stands up, and practically falls over once he's on his feet. But he eventually gets himself back up, kind of steadies himself, and then he thinks, okay, I need to go check on my 4 kids and make sure they are okay. But the second Ephraim began to move in his house, it was like his body did not obey his mind. Because moments later, instead of checking on his kids, Ephraim had wandered out his front door and was just standing out in front of his house, just kind of staring off into the distance, having no idea why he walked out there. The village where Ephraim lived was called Nios, and Nios is extremely rural. There is no electricity, there is no running water, and there are no paved roads for miles. The village is actually split into two parts. There is Upper Nios and Lower Nios. Ephraim lived in Upper Nios right near this big beautiful lake called Lake Nios, but the majority of villagers lived in Lower Nios, which was below the lake. So that morning, after Ephraim kind of found himself standing outside of his hut for no reason, he began looking around in hopes that other people would be out and about in Upper Nios where he lived, so he could go talk to them and try to figure out what was wrong with him or, what was going on generally. But as he scanned around Upper Nios, he saw there was not another soul anywhere. He was it. He was the only person walking around, so without giving it much thought, Ephraim decided he would just start walking down towards Lower Nios to try to talk to someone down there. And so he left his hut, and he began walking down the hill that would take him to Lower Nios. After Ephraim got about halfway down this hill, right when he was near Lake Nios, he stopped because suddenly he became totally aware of the fact that the world was totally silent. Normally, the baboons in the nearby forest would be barking, and insects would be humming, and birds would be chirping, but now it was just completely, totally silent. Even the mosquitoes that were a totally annoying, constant presence in Ephraim's life were gone. It was like the entire world had just shut down. And as Ephraim is looking around, wondering what is going on here, he hears off to his right, over near the lake, a woman shrieking at the top of her lungs. And so Ephraim whipped his head in the direction the screams were coming from, and he saw there was this woman about 100 feet away. She was a local, and she was looking right at Ephraim, and she was barely dressed, and she was ripping the rest of her clothes off, and she was just screaming. And so acting on instinct, Ephraim immediately turned and just started running towards this woman. And as he is bounding towards her, getting closer and closer, he is starting to notice there are these strange shapes on the ground kind of near this woman, but as he was staring at them, he just could not quite place what they were. But when he got about 20 feet away from this shrieking woman, he stopped again because he realized the shapes on the ground were this woman's entire family. They were all just laying on the ground as if they were sleeping. And near them was all of their cattle, also just laying on the ground as if they were sleeping. But as Ephraim stared at each of these people and each of these animals on the ground, he saw there was some blood around their noses and their mouths, and he realized no person who is sleeping would be that still. These people are all dead. These animals are all dead. And so standing there, Ephraim turned his attention from the bodies back to this woman who had dropped to her knees, and she was grabbing her father's arm and yanking on it and screaming for him to please wake up. But Ephraim could tell there was nothing she could do. Everyone was gone. And Ephraim knew somewhere deep down that, he is supposed to go over and help this woman or console her, but suddenly this wave of fear came over him. The combination of having no idea what is going on, his mind really was not working still, and now seeing all these dead people, it was like he just could not handle it. And so even though he felt terrible about this, Ephraim took one last look at this very distraught woman and her deceased family, and he turned and he ran away. And when he got back to the main trail, he continued downhill in the direction of Lower Nios. The villagers in Lower Nios lived in these tiny huts with tin roofs that were closely grouped together, and usually, even early in the morning, Lower Nios was a very happy and lively place with kids running around, and animals walking in the road, and music playing. But as Ephraim came down the hill and was within earshot of Lower Nios, it was deadly silent. And so with panic starting to rise inside of Ephraim, he began to run at full speed, hoping that when he turned the corner and looked down the main road of Lower Nios, he would see the people he was hoping he would see. But when he turned the corner and looked down Main Street, all he saw were dead animals everywhere. They completely covered the streets, the sidewalk, everything. And so at this point, Ephraim was so desperate to see another person that he kept his eyes looking straight ahead so as not to look at all the dead animals, and just ran straight into Lower Nios. And he turned towards the first hut he saw, and he ripped the door open, and he stepped inside. And as soon as he did, he just stopped because on the ground right in front of him was a woman who was very clearly deceased, just laying in the middle of the floor. She had a bowl of corn right near her hand as if she had been eating, and then just fell dead. And so Ephraim, he is staring at this dead woman. And then he looks up, and he realizes the bedroom is right in eyesight, and he can see her family in their beds. And at first Ephraim thought, oh, they are sleeping. But then as he continued to stare through the doorway into this room, he saw none of them were moving. Their chests were not going up and down from breathing. Her whole family, they were dead too. At this, Ephraim kind of stumbled backwards out of the hut, and then he turned around to face the road he had just been on with all the animals. And when he saw the road again, it was like a piece of his brain started working properly again, because he realized those were not animal bodies. All those bodies he saw when he came in, those were people. Yes, there were some animals, but most of them were people. He could see people slumped on top of each other, kind of piled up in doorways. He saw one person who was on his motorcycle in the middle of the road, just slumped over his handlebars, and many of the bodies were either naked or partially clothed with piles of clothing next to them, as if they had been trying to rip their clothes off as fast as they could, like the woman up at the lake had been doing. And as Ephraim looked around in horror, he also realized that there were no markings or cuts or wounds on any of these people. It was like they were just going about their lives when suddenly they died. And so without anything else to do, Ephraim just continued to walk in the direction he had come into the village, hoping that if he kept on going, he might run into someone who was alive. And so he begins walking down the road. He is stepping over bodies. He has no idea what to make of this. And then way down the road up ahead, he sees there are two people coming towards him. There is a man and what looks like his son, and they are jogging down the road, stumbling over bodies, running towards Ephraim. And so Ephraim stops, expecting these people are going to stop and talk to him. But as these two people got closer, Ephraim saw both of them, the father and the son. Their eyes were wide, and they were looking straight ahead with kind of a distant, 1,000-yard stare. And they did not stop for a second for Ephraim. It was like they did not even see him. They just kept on running down the road past all the bodies. Ephraim did not try to stop them. He just watched as they passed, and then at some point they veered off the road and ran into the forest and disappeared. And it was at this moment that another part of Ephraim's brain seemed to kind of fit into place. Because as he watched this father and son disappear, he suddenly had this memory come flooding back into his mind, and it was a memory of when he was a kid and his grandfather told him a story. And the story was about Nyos villagers a long, long time ago who decided they wanted to cross Lake Nyos from one side to the other. And so their leader magically parted the waters of Lake Nyos, creating a walkway on the lake bed from one side to the other. And the villagers began to walk, and then about halfway across, a mosquito landed on the leader's shoulder. And when he went to slap the mosquito, he lost control of the waters, and they came crashing down and drowned all of them. Ephraim's grandfather told Ephraim that the ghosts of these drowned villagers now resided between these two big rocks located near Lower Nyos. And so growing up, Ephraim, along with many other people in this village, believed that because of these ghosts, Lower Nyos must be haunted. And in fact, that was actually why Ephraim built his house in Upper Nyos, to avoid these ghosts. And so now, as this memory of hearing this story from his grandfather has come flooding back to Ephraim, he thinks to himself, of course, all of this is the work of those ghosts. And so, fearing he would be attacked next, Ephraim turned and just continued running down the road, dodging bodies as he went. And as he ran along, periodically he would stop at various tin huts, and he would fling the door open in hopes he would find some survivors. But each time he went inside, everybody in there would be dead, lying in their beds, or sitting in chairs, or lying on the ground. But after running for quite a while, Ephraim turned to go into yet another hut, and right as he reached for the door opened on its own, and standing in front of him was the owner of this hut. His name was Joseph McQuain, and he was in much worse shape than Ephraim. The night before, Joseph had been inside of his hut when suddenly outside he heard that very loud booming sound that sounded like thunder to Ephraim. And then after hearing the sound, Joseph heard his daughter in her bed making this terrible snoring sound. And so instinctively, Joseph turned to walk over to his daughter to make sure she was okay. But he only got a few steps before he collapsed to the ground. He had woken up that morning with cuts all over his arms from where he fell. And he was also totally exhausted and very confused like Ephraim. And so he managed to drag himself over to his daughter's bed, and he pulled himself up onto her bed. And when he got up there, he realized his daughter was deceased. And so now Joseph has opened the door, and he is looking out, and there is all these dead people everywhere, and Ephraim is looking back at him. And Joseph just cannot process anything. He is just standing there in a total daze. And Ephraim, he wanted to say something, but no words could come out. And so he too just stood there looking at Joseph. And the two men just stood there right on the threshold of this hut, staring at each other, saying nothing for several minutes, until finally they both just extended their hands and shook silently. And then Ephraim turned around and ran back into the road. And so Joseph at first followed Ephraim kind of out of instinct. But very quickly, he veered off from Ephraim, and Joseph went into his neighbor's hut to see if they were okay. But when he opened the door and went inside, he saw all of his neighbors were deceased. But Joseph, he barely reacted to this. It was like he was so numb to what was going on, he just could not process it. But after seeing all of his neighbors dead, somewhere deep down inside of his consciousness, Joseph knew he had to go find help. That was his mission. And so he left his neighbor's hut, he ran back to his own hut, he climbed onto his motorcycle, and he started to drive. It took Joseph a long time to drive to the next closest village. But when he got there, there were people, and they were all alive. And so Joseph tried to tell them what had happened in his village. But Joseph just had such a hard time putting his thoughts together that his sentences just did not make sense. He was kind of incoherent. And then when he did make sense, the things he was talking about, an entire village just suddenly dying, sounded absolutely crazy. And so nobody at this other village took Joseph seriously. And so that day, nobody from this other village went to Nios to see what was going on. But the next day, people from this other village did go to Nios, and when they got there, it was exactly as Joseph had said. The whole village was dead. And as authorities would soon find out, it was not just Nios that was affected by this tragic event. Several villages not far from Nios had also suffered mass casualty events on the morning of August 22, 1986. And soon, news of these strange mass death events in West Africa were making the news all over the world. And so on August 25th, 3 days after this terrible event, an American scientist named Joseph Devine turned on his TV and saw the news coming out of West Africa. The newscasters were totally baffled about how this could have happened, and no one can figure out what killed these people. And Devine is just staring at his TV in shock. And then he turns, runs to his phone, and he calls his contact at the US government and told them, "You got to send me to Nios." And because his contact knew Devine's background, he immediately said, "Yes, I will get you on a flight as soon as we can." Devine and his scientific partner, Haraldur Sigurdsson, arrived in Nios 2 days later on August 27th. When they got there, they saw the military was burying the dead in these huge mass graves. And looking on were the few survivors of this event, like Joseph and Ephraim. Along with Ephraim's family, they also survived, as well as other villagers who had come to see what happened. And so, as Devine and Sigurdsson kind of maneuver their way through this crowd of very solemn people, they heard them talking about what they thought happened to all these people, and the theories ranged from secret governmental experiments to invisible superweapons to even atomic explosions. Others, like Ephraim, believed this was paranormal, that those ghosts from the drowned villagers had attacked the village. But Devine and Sigurdsson were reasonably sure that none of those theories were correct. They felt like they did know what actually happened because they had actually witnessed a tragedy like this before, but on a much smaller scale. 2 years earlier, and 60 miles south of Nios, in an area called Lake Manoun, 37 people suddenly dropped dead. And Devine and Sigurdsson had been sent out there to try to figure out what happened to these people. And after lots of experimentation, they came up with a theory that explained what happened, and they called it unknown unnatural hazard. They tried to warn people in the area that this could happen again. And in fact, Sigurdsson had written an entire scientific paper about this theory and submitted it to a prestigious science journal. But nobody took Devine or Sigurdsson seriously. What they were proposing sounded made up. It sounded preposterous. But now in Nios, it looked very much like their unnatural hazard had happened again. Devine and Sigurdsson would leave the group of people watching this mass burying take place, and they would make their way up the hill to Lake Nios, where they would immediately get to work taking water samples from deep inside the lake. And after capping these samples, the lids began popping off. And that was the moment that Devine and Sigurdsson knew their unknown unnatural hazard theory had to be correct. Lake Nios is not your typical lake. It is a crater lake, which means it sits inside of a volcanic crater, which is a big, deep, bowl-like pit that was formed from a past volcanic explosion. And because of this volcanic activity, there is carbon dioxide in Lake Nios, a lot of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, or CO2 for short, is an odorless, invisible gas that we actually breathe out when we exhale. Now, if you inhale a little bit of CO2, that will not hurt you. If you inhale a little bit more, like a medium amount of CO2, you could feel dizzy and nauseous. Your skin will start to feel like it is on fire. You will have rapid breathing. It will be horrible, but you will most likely survive if you stop breathing CO2. And if you breathe in a ton of CO2, you are dead. The CO2 in Lake Nios had been trapped at the bottom of the lake for as long as anyone knew. But on the night of August 21st, 1986, something happened that caused that trapped gas to be released. Now remember, on that night, August 21st, Ephraim recalled hearing what he thought was thunder outside, and also Joseph would recall hearing a loud, booming sound that night. Now we do not know exactly what that sound was, but it is safe to say that that noise, whatever it was connected to releasing the gas. Maybe it was the sound of a rock slide, and big rocks plummeted into the lake and hit the lake bottom and freed the gas that way. Or maybe it was just an actual volcanic eruption inside of the lake. Whatever it was, when the CO2 was freed, it bubbled to the top like it bubbled and popped off the lids of their sample tubes. And when it reached the top of the water, it kind of formed a cloud above the lake. Now, we cannot see the cloud, but you can imagine a big cloud. And then this toxic CO2 cloud kind of rolled its way down the hill towards Lower Nios and other villages in the area. And when this big toxic cloud began coming in contact with people, with animals, and insects, virtually all of them died. As for the few who survived, like Ephraim and his family and Joseph, they were left feeling horribly confused, disoriented, nauseous, totally dizzy from CO2 poisoning. But when they finally were able to get away from Nios and breathe fresh air, the effects of CO2 poisoning wore off and they were okay. This deadly CO2 phenomenon was exactly what happened on a much smaller scale 2 years earlier at Lake Manoun. It was the unknown, unnatural hazard that Devine and Sigurdsson had tried to warn people about. The official death toll of the Lake Nyos disaster was more than 1,700 people and more than 3,500 livestock, although exact numbers will likely never be known. Today, people have moved back into Upper and Lower Nyos, including Ephraim, despite the fact that authorities have said that lake is still very dangerous, and another unknown, unnatural hazard, aka a CO2 disaster, could absolutely happen again. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.